The shadows of that night haunt me still, pressing into my thoughts with an unbearable weight. It's as if they've taken on a life of their own, creeping through my mind, wrapping around every quiet moment, and suffocating any sense of peace. No matter how far I try to run from it, that night claws its way back, relentless and unyielding. It wasn't my dog. That's what the police are saying. My beloved Kaylee, my 70-pound pit lab mix, killed those people. They claim she snapped, broke into the neighboring cabin, and mauled an innocent family. But that's not what happened. Whatever killed them is still out there, lurking in the woods of northern Minnesota. And it's not my dog. My name is Drew, and I adopted Kaylee from a rescue group 2 years ago. From the moment our eyes met, I felt an instant connection. A silent promise that I would protect her as much as she would protect me. I still remember the day I first saw her, trembling in the corner of her kennel, but wagging her tail with cautious hope. She was an untrained but affectionate wrecking ball of energy, her every leap and bark bursting with a need to belong. Her black fur shone in the sunlight, with her white paws and muzzle making her look like a miniature bear. Despite my many attempts to rename her Beverly, she answered only to Kaylee, as if she had already decided who she was meant to be. Kaylee was loyal, protective, and always at my side. She loved everyone she met, greeting strangers with a wagging tail and eager eyes. Yet now, the thought of her being accused of such horror twists my stomach in knots. I've spent countless sleepless nights replaying every moment of that weekend, trying to understand how things spiraled so far out of control. The police insist she's to blame for the terror that unfolded, but they didn't know her like I did. They didn't see the kindness in her eyes or feel the steady reassurance of her presence. I know her, and I know the truth. It all began when my friend Marcus suggested a board game retreat. We invited 2 friends, Elle and Rachel, to join us at a lakeside cabin in northern Minnesota. The picturesque setting was perfect. Shared docks, canoes, a fire pit, and towering pines. We spent our first night playing games, grilling burgers, and enjoying the peace of the wilderness. But beneath the idyllic surface, something was watching. The first strange occurrence happened the next morning. The air carried an odd stillness, a quiet so heavy it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. It was as if the world was bracing for something. While walking Kaylee, I spotted 2 boys on the dock. One was urinating into the lake while the other gleefully tore apart a pool noodle and fed it to unsuspecting ducks. Later, the same boys emerged from the woods, now armed with rifles, heading deeper into the forest. Unease prickled at my skin. I resolved to keep Kaylee leashed and close by. That evening, Marcus and I sat by the fire, gazing at the stars as the others went into town for supplies. The serenity shattered when Kaylee's deep growl alerted us to a figure standing beyond the firelight. One of the boys, dripping wet, his eyes vacant, and his movements unnatural. When Marcus tried to approach him, the boy turned away, his drool glistening in the firelight. Marcus escorted him toward the neighboring cabin, but something about the encounter left me uneasy. Hours passed, and Marcus didn't return. When the others came back, we decided to check on him. The neighboring cabin was eerily silent, the door ajar. Inside, we found Marcus unconscious on the floor, his breathing shallow, his eyes darting aimlessly. Before we could process what was happening, a blood-curdling scream erupted upstairs. Rachel stumbled down the stairs, her face pale. "There's someone upstairs. She's dead." A shadow moved behind her. One of the boys, covered in blood, lunged at her, his teeth bared. Before he could attack, Kaylee crashed into him, a black blur of fury. Her growls drowned out the boy's inhuman snarls. "Run!" I shouted, dragging Rachel toward the door. Elle hesitated, but the growing chaos propelled her to follow us into the night. We dashed to the car, the forest echoing with snarls and screams. I called for Callie, but she didn't emerge. My heart sank as we drove off, leaving her behind. Hours later, I returned alone, armed with nothing but a flashlight. My hands trembled as I gripped the cold metal, each step toward the cabin feeling heavier than the last. Doubts clawed at my resolve, fear whispering in my ear to turn back. But the thought of leaving Kaylee, if she was still alive, compelled me forward. The cabin was in shambles. Blood smeared the walls, furniture lay overturned, and the stench of decay filled the air. I found Kaylee standing on the deck, her fur matted and eyes glassy. She staggered toward me, her tail wagging weakly. Behind her, something massive moved in the shadows. A grotesque figure of twisted limbs and hollow eyes. My flashlight flickered, and I froze as it advanced, its guttural growls resonating in my chest. With a burst of adrenaline, I grabbed Kaylee and bolted toward the car, the creature's heavy footsteps pounding behind us. We barely escaped as its roar pierced the night. The police found the carnage but dismissed my account as hysteria. They pinned the blame on Kaylee, citing the bite marks on the boy's body. She was taken from me, labeled dangerous, and euthanized. But I know the truth. Whatever killed those people is still out there, lurking in the woods, and the weight of that knowledge presses on me every waking moment. I can't sleep without seeing flashes of its twisted form in my dreams, its hollow eyes staring straight through me. Each morning, I wake drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as though I've been running for my life. It's as if the forest has etched its menace into my very being, its presence seeping into my nightmares like an unrelenting shadow. Every time I close my eyes, I hear its guttural growl, feel its cold breath against my neck. This story, my story, feels like it will never end, as if the woods are alive, whispering my name, daring me to return. The night before we left, I dreamed of the city, its hum, its lights, the way it always seemed alive even in the dead of night. In my dream, the streets were empty, unnaturally silent. A shadow stretched across the skyline, blotting out the familiar glow of neon signs. I woke up in a cold sweat, Harper gently shaking me awake. "Bad dream?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with curiosity, her eyes searching my face for answers. She tilted her head slightly, her amusement faltering as she noticed the unease lingering in my expression. "Yeah, I guess so," I muttered, brushing it off, though my voice carried a trace of uncertainty. A faint chill lingered in the room, and I couldn't shake the feeling of something unseen pressing against my chest. Little did I know that unease would follow me to the mountains. I wasn't familiar with the mountains. A self-proclaimed city boy, as my girlfriend Harper loved to call me, I had grown up surrounded by the chaos of honking horns, crowded sidewalks, and a skyline dominated by concrete and glass. My days were filled with the hum of subway trains and the glow of neon lights, far removed from the tranquility of nature. The closest I'd come to wilderness was a weekend hike through a city park, where the trees seemed dwarfed by the apartment buildings beyond. I grew up with traffic jams and towering skyscrapers, a world where the wilderness was a distant concept. But when Harper proposed a weekend in a secluded cabin, I didn't hesitate. A week alone with her? Absolutely. No work, no stress, just us. Yet it wouldn't be just us. Harper's best friend Sophie and Sophie's boyfriend Damien would join us. Sophie had been Harper's ride or die since middle school, and Damien, though quiet, had a sharp wit that could cut through any awkward silence. Harper's excitement about the trip was contagious. The cabin, deep in southern Appalachia, seemed like a perfect escape. She was finally going home, to the mountains she missed so deeply. I thought this trip might ease the guilt I carried for pulling her into my concrete jungle. I felt a strange unease creep in as we ascended the mountain roads. The winding paths, lined with towering pines, seemed to close in on us as the sun dipped below the horizon. Harper's laughter, mingling with Sophie's, should have been comforting, but it felt distant, like the echoes of a memory. The weight of the forest's silence pressed on me, heavier with each mile. Harper's stories of Appalachian life filled the drive with a mix of nostalgia and foreboding. She recounted tales of ghostly apparitions seen by her ancestors, warnings about lights in the woods that led travelers astray, and the legend of the Hollow Man, a creature said to mimic voices to lure victims deeper into the forest. Her voice carried a mix of amusement and unease, as if she herself wasn't sure how much of it to believe. I tried to laugh along, but each story seemed to tighten the grip of the darkened woods around us. Tales of copperheads, ancient legends, and family superstitions spilled out as the sun dipped behind the mountains. She giggled when recounting how her mama once decapitated a snake and made her study its markings. I laughed with her, masking the unease growing in my chest. As we turned onto the gravel road leading to the cabin, the shadows stretched longer, twisting into strange shapes under the dim headlights. The cabin appeared suddenly, a 2-story structure with fairy lights strung along the porch and tiki torches glowing faintly. The upstairs windows loomed large and dark, while the downstairs, smaller and more claustrophobic, felt like an afterthought. I wanted to comment on its unsettling proportions, but bit my tongue. Harper didn't need my negativity. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. As I stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots felt unnaturally loud. Sophie and Damien greeted us warmly, their voices breaking the eerie stillness. Yet, my eyes were drawn to the tree line. Something, or someone, stood there, motionless. The figure's presence was unnerving, its stillness unnatural. My skin prickled, but I shook it off. It was probably nothing. Probably. We weren't the first to arrive. Damien waved at us from the porch while Sophie stepped out to embrace Harper. Their laughter echoed as I unloaded our bags, yet my gaze drifted to the tree line. Something moved there, just beyond the first row of pines. A figure, slight and still. Was it Sophie? My smile faded when I waved and received no response. The figure simply watched, unmoving. "Nick?" Harper's voice broke my focus. She was pointing out a gazebo further down the property. "Isn't it beautiful? I want to lie there all night." Her eyes gleamed with excitement, her smile wide and unguarded, a stark contrast to the unease simmering in my chest. I forced a grin, though my jaw felt tight, and the knot tightening in my gut seemed to coil deeper, pulling at my nerves. Dinner was a casual affair. Harper and Sophie reminisced about their childhoods while Damien and I bonded over shared interests. Still, my mind wandered back to the figure I'd seen. When the laughter subsided and the night deepened, I found myself drawn to the window. The forest beyond was a wall of impenetrable black. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. It felt as though the trees were watching, their shadows shifting unnaturally. After dinner, the 4 of us settled into a makeshift bed on the living room floor for a movie marathon. Laughter and popcorn filled the air, but I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the woods. Halfway through the second movie, I excused myself to use the bathroom. The half bath was small, the window above the toilet barely larger than a shoebox. As I washed my hands, movement caught my eye. Through the tiny window I saw Damien standing in the dark, his face eerily expressionless. The faint moonlight illuminated his eyes, which seemed too wide, unblinking, and glassy. He didn't move, not a twitch or a shift of weight, just stood there, staring directly at me. A shiver ran down my spine as my mind raced to process what I was seeing. But Damien was still in the living room, laughing at something Sophie had said. My chest tightened. I returned to the others, forcing myself to stay calm. "Did anyone go outside?" I asked. Sophie looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Damien raised an eyebrow. "No," Harper said softly, her brow furrowing as a concern clouded her expression. Her voice carried a gentle but probing tone, as if she could sense the weight of something unspoken. "Are you okay?" I nodded, but my mind reeled, my thoughts spiraling into a frenzy. My palms grew clammy, and I felt a cold sweat bead on the back of my neck. If Damien was here, who the hell was outside? The question echoed in my head, each repetition tightening the grip of fear around my chest. The unease grew unbearable. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind felt amplified. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see something peering back at me. Harper noticed my agitation. "Nick, you're acting strange," she whispered. Her concern only deepened my paranoia. I wanted to tell her everything, but feared sounding insane. The night unraveled into chaos. Sophie and Harper ventured into the woods to gather mushrooms, promising to stay close. When Sophie returned alone, breathless and hysterical, she could barely form words. "I lost her. She's gone. She saw Nick." Her eyes locked onto me, wide with terror. "But you were with me." Damien held her trembling frame. "Nick's been here the whole time," he said firmly. Sophie shook her head violently. "No. She followed you. I saw you." The door slammed open. Harper stood there, a basket of mushrooms in hand. "What's going on?" Sophie's knees buckled. "You followed him," she whispered, pointing at me. Harper frowned. "No, I thought I saw Nick, but it wasn't him. It was—" Her voice trailed off and her face paled. The tension exploded. Shadows seemed to writhe in the corners of the room, elongating and twisting as if they had a life of their own. The faint glow from the fireplace flickered erratically, casting shapes that danced like sinister puppets. The air grew thick, suffocating with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like blood. Every breath felt heavy, and an unnatural chill crawled up my spine, amplifying the dread that clung to every corner of the room. A loud bang echoed from the back of the cabin, followed by a low, guttural growl. Damien grabbed a fire poker, his face pale but determined. "Stay together," he commanded, his voice trembling. By dawn, we were packing the car in a frenzy. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a threat. As I helped Harper into the passenger seat, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. But it wasn't me. The reflection grinned, its teeth jagged and wrong. Harper's hand tightened around mine. "Don't look back," she whispered. As we sped down the gravel road, the cabin's silhouette disappeared in the rearview mirror. But the mountains watched, their peaks cloaked in mist, their depths hiding whatever horrors we had narrowly escaped. My phone buzzed once, a single message from an unknown number. "It knows you left." Weeks later, back in the city, Harper and I tried to move on. But every so often, I'd catch her staring out the window, her reflection slightly off. It wasn't just the way her features seemed a bit distorted in the glass. It was the way her eyes lingered too long, as though she were watching something I couldn't see. And when she smiled at me, I couldn't help but notice her freckle was missing. It was supposed to be a graduation trip to remember, a serene getaway in a secluded cabin deep in the northern woods. Instead, it became a waking nightmare, one that etched fear into our minds forever. What was intended as a time to celebrate and bond unraveled into an experience none of us could explain or forget. Sam, an 18-year-old with a love for music and a cautious outlook on life, decides to set aside his reservations for this trip. The chance to celebrate with his family and his supportive girlfriend Emily, along with the hope of creating lasting memories, ultimately outweighs his usual preference for familiarity and routine. Despite his usual distaste for wilderness outings, the promise of bonding, relaxation, and adventure in a well-equipped cabin lures him in. On arrival, the cabin seems idyllic, with pristine rooms, abundant plants, and unexpected luxuries like a pool table, a dartboard, and a dock by a tranquil river. Sam notices how spotless the cabin is, almost unnaturally so. Yet, his focus is on the fun ahead, brushing aside any oddities in favor of the excitement. The group quickly unpacks, with the family dispersing to explore the cabin. Emily marvels at the decor, while Sam wanders through the rooms, noting the abundance of healthy, thriving plants. There's an aura of perfection that feels strange but alluring. After dinner, everyone splits off to relax. Sam and Emily head to the game room while his parents choose a movie, and his younger brother dives into the board games. Sam and Emily retreat to the game room, their laughter echoing as they spar over a fierce pool game. Emily playfully nudges Sam when he misses a shot, her competitive streak surfacing as she boasts about her unexpected skill. Sam counters with mock exasperation, grinning as he sets up for his next turn. The atmosphere between them is light and comfortable, their connection evident in the way they tease and encourage each other. It's a rare moment of levity that contrasts with the mounting unease around them. The soft hum of the night and the occasional rustle of trees add to the cozy ambiance. During their match, Sam's gaze lingers on a peculiar picture frame displaying a large family, their faces eerily vibrant despite the photo's apparent age. The image unnerves him briefly, but Emily's teasing draws his attention back. Later, in the bathroom, the ordinary turns sinister. While showering, Sam notices a tiny black hole in the ceiling. Curiosity compels him to investigate. He dislodges a hidden camera, its lens staring coldly back at him. His breath caught in his throat, and an icy chill raced down his spine. The weight of violation sank in as his hands trembled, clutching the device. His heart thundered in his chest, the room suddenly feeling smaller, darker. He stumbled backward, his mind spinning with disbelief and dread. His stomach twists as he examines it, and dread blooms when he realizes it's active. Panic grips him as he frantically searches the cabin, uncovering more cameras in invasive locations. Behind a potted plant, nestled within the wall-mounted clock, and even pointed at the shower. He doesn't want to alarm the others yet. His mind spins with questions. Who placed these cameras? How long had they been there? And worst of all, who was watching? Unable to contain his unease, Sam realizes these cameras were not placed by accident. The meticulous cleanliness and vibrant plants take on a sinister tone, as though every detail of the cabin was designed to mask something darker. In the living room, he discovers a hidden journal tucked behind a false panel in the bookshelf. Its pages are filled with disturbing entries from previous guests, recounting strange occurrences, feelings of being watched, and chillingly, accounts of people vanishing without a trace. One particular entry sends a shiver down his spine. They watch, and they wait. If you stay, you'll never leave. The lights flicker, drawing Sam back to the present. A guttural noise echoes through the cabin, freezing him in his tracks. He rushes to Emily, urging her to follow him, and together they try to wake the others. However, the family appears unnaturally deep in slumber, their breaths shallow and synchronized, as though under a spell. Fear consumes Sam as he realizes this is no coincidence. Desperate, Sam and Emily attempt to flee, only to find the cabin's doors and windows sealed shut. The journal's warnings flood his mind as he smashes a window with a chair, but the sight outside chills him further. Beyond the shattered glass, the forest is alive with shadowy figures. Their elongated forms writhe unnaturally, and their glowing eyes flicker like dying embers. The oppressive darkness seems to pulse, the whispers growing louder and more distinct. "Stay! Stay!" Sam feels his chest tighten, a primal fear rooting him to the spot. The woods are alive with shadowy figures, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Whispers surround the cabin, low and urgent. "Stay! Stay! Stay!" The shadows grow bolder, pressing against the glass, their distorted forms barely distinguishable. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sam and Emily create a makeshift torch using a lighter and an aerosol can. They ignite a fire in the kitchen, setting off the smoke alarms. The noise rouses the family, snapping them out of their unnatural sleep. Together, they break through the now weakened door and sprint into the woods, the shadowy figures pursuing them. The family runs blindly, hearts pounding as the whispers grow deafening. Finally, they stumble upon a parked ranger's vehicle. Sam frantically signals for help, and the family piles in just as the shadows close in. The ranger, startled but quick to act, drives them to safety. In the safety of the hospital, Sam recounts the horrors to skeptical authorities. When investigators visit the cabin, they find no sign of cameras or the journal. The cabin appears ordinary, save for the scorched living room. Despite their doubts, the investigators note deep, claw-like marks etched into the walls, too large and deliberate to be dismissed as natural. Days later, as the family tries to move on, Sam's phone buzzes. It's a video, footage from the hidden cameras capturing every moment of their terror. Accompanying it is a text, "We'll be watching." Sam stares at the video, his heart racing. His palms are clammy as he grips the phone tighter, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Each rapid thud of his heart feels louder than the eerie silence around him. His stomach churns with a sickening mix of fear and helplessness, and his breath comes in shallow gasps. He blinks, unable to tear his eyes away, as dread pools in his chest, anchoring him to the spot. Who sent it? Where were they watching from? The unanswered questions linger, feeding an ever-growing paranoia. As he deletes the message, a faint whisper escapes from his phone's speaker. "Stay." The screen flickers, and for a brief moment, Sam sees his reflection, but it's not his. It began with an irresistible lure. A stunning Airbnb listing for a cottage nestled in the Rockies promised an unforgettable retreat. The serene landscapes, luxurious interiors, and an enticing hot tub exuded an almost hypnotic charm, as though promising a sanctuary untouched by the chaos of the world. Yet, beneath this idyllic facade, an unspoken unease seemed to stir, hinting at secrets that lay buried within the Rockies' shadows. 6 friends eagerly booked the getaway, unaware of the terror that awaited them beneath the picturesque facade. The photos radiated perfection, but sometimes beauty conceals its darkest secrets. What looked like a dream escape was about to turn into a living nightmare. Sarah, a free-spirited 24-year-old, arranged a weekend trip for her friends to celebrate her upcoming birthday. The secluded cottage was breathtaking, panoramic mountain views, an inviting hot tub, and 6 luxurious rooms. The group's excitement was palpable as they unpacked, but an unsettling quietness hung over the forest, and even the cheerful banter couldn't shake the subtle unease. Nick and Emma, the older and more composed pair, were in their early 30s and had a knack for keeping things grounded. They immediately gravitated toward the back patio, armed with books and a stash of weed. Meanwhile, Sarah, Brandon, Xander, and CJ explored the nearby trails. The sunlight filtering through the dense canopy created a kaleidoscope of autumn colors, and laughter echoed through the serene surroundings. Yet, small anomalies gnawed at their sense of ease. The peculiar warning sign by the door, "Do not go out alone at night," and Brandon's missing sunglasses mysteriously reappearing on the dining table hours later. The first day unfolded uneventfully, but the forest seemed to close in as night fell. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and a faint, persistent rustling in the underbrush seemed to follow their movements. Dakota, who prided himself on logic and skepticism, joked about the warning sign, dismissing it as a gimmick to spook tourists. However, even he seemed unnerved when they found claw marks etched deep into one of the porch beams. By the second evening, the group began noticing more unsettling details. Sarah woke up in the middle of the night to faint scratching at her window, only to find nothing when she looked outside. Nick discovered that the pantry, initially filled with non-perishable food, had been disturbed. Several cans were missing, while others had been opened and left half-empty, their contents spilled onto the shelves. A strange, sticky residue coated the pantry door, and faint claw-like scratches marked the edges as if something had pried it open. Several items were missing, though no one claimed to have touched them. Xander, typically the life of the party, grew unusually quiet, his gaze frequently darting toward the darkened tree line. At dusk on the third day, tensions boiled over when Brandon and Xander argued about an old grudge. Brandon, seething, grabbed a flashlight and stormed off into the forest. "I'll be back when you learn how to grow up," he shouted, disappearing into the dense woods. Hours passed, and he didn't return. The group's initial annoyance turned into worry as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first sign of something amiss came as a guttural, inhuman screech echoed through the forest. Everyone froze, their expressions ranging from confusion to fear. Dakota's sharp eyes spotted a massive claw mark etched into the cottage's wooden frame, far larger and deeper than the ones they'd seen earlier. CJ swore he saw shadows darting between the trees, moving too quickly to be animals. The power suddenly cut out, plunging the house into darkness. A suffocating silence followed, broken only by their ragged breaths. Sarah lit a lantern she'd found in the kitchen, its flame sputtering softly with each adjustment of the wick. The faint hiss of the lantern filled the silence, accompanied by the rhythmic creak of its swinging handle as she moved it. Flickering shadows danced wildly on the walls, stretching and contracting like restless spirits, each movement intensifying the group's unease. The dim light played tricks on their eyes, making every corner of the room feel alive with lurking threats. The group huddled together, whispering theories that ranged from bears to pranksters to something far more sinister. As they debated their next move, a loud thud reverberated through the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. The group scrambled as a grotesque figure loomed outside the broken patio door. It was like nothing they'd seen before, a massive, misshapen creature with glowing yellow eyes and sinewy limbs that moved unnaturally. Its guttural growls sent shivers down their spines. Sarah grabbed a fire poker, her hands trembling. CJ and Xander armed themselves with kitchen knives. Emma, trying to keep everyone calm, whispered, "We stick together. No one goes off alone." The creature stalked closer, its movements unnervingly deliberate. The group's collective scream pierced the night as the beast lunged, swiping at them with claws that tore through furniture like paper. In the chaos, they managed to injure the creature with their makeshift weapons, but not without cost. Nick's arm was slashed, and blood pooled on the floor as he screamed in pain, his voice raw with fear and agony. His face contorted in shock as he clutched his wounded arm, trembling uncontrollably. Emma rushed to his side, her hands fumbling as she tried to stem the bleeding with a dish towel, tears welling in her eyes. "We have to stop this. We're not prepared for this," she choked out, her voice shaking. The others hovered helplessly, their wide eyes darting between Nick and the shattered glass, their breaths shallow as the weight of their terror bore down on them. The beast emitted a bone-chilling howl before retreating, leaving a trail of blood and destruction in its wake. The group spent the remaining hours of the night in terrified silence, clutching their weapons and jumping at every noise. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, they ventured outside cautiously. Near the tree line, they found Brandon's mutilated body, his expression frozen in terror. The sight left them numb with grief and fear. Emma stammered, "We have to leave, now!" They packed hurriedly, their hands shaking. Driving down the winding mountain road, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A shadowed figure stood at the edge of the forest, watching them leave. She didn't tell the others, unsure if it was her imagination or something worse. Later that day, Sarah checked the Airbnb listing, but it was gone. In its place was a cryptic message: "This property is no longer available." The chilling warning sign, "Do not go out alone at night," remained seared into her memory like an indelible scar. Each time she closed her eyes, the forest's dark embrace and the creature's glowing, predatory eyes haunted her. The guttural growls echoed in her ears as if the beast were still stalking her from the shadows of her mind. The weight of Brandon's loss bore heavily on them all. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried to explain the unexplainable to herself. She felt the horror clawing at her sanity, the sheer reality of what they had encountered refusing to dissipate. Every creak, every shadow, every faint whisper of the wind sent her heart racing, as though the Rockies had marked her as its own. Even after leaving the mountains, the group's bond felt fractured. CJ stopped answering calls, Xander grew reclusive, and Emma's once steady demeanor wavered, her laughter now strained and brittle. Sarah's nights were a parade of sleepless hours, where every dream was a vivid replay of their ordeal: the shattered glass, the beast's monstrous howl, and Brandon's lifeless eyes staring back at her. The question lingered like a specter. How long until the nightmare followed them again? Sarah's mind drifted back to the shadowed figure she had seen at the forest's edge, its presence an unspoken warning that their ordeal was far from over. The image of those glowing eyes burned into her memory, a constant reminder that the darkness wasn't confined to the mountains. It felt as if the forest had extended its reach, leaving a piece of itself behind to haunt her wherever she went. As Sarah stared at the flickering screen of her laptop, the empty search bar mocking her, she couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly escaped. Somewhere, deep in the forest, the forest was silent, unnaturally so. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, the branches above me motionless under a dull, clouded sky. The ground beneath me was damp, the earthy scent of decaying leaves mingling with the sharp tang of moss. Each step I took felt heavy, the squelch of mud clinging to my boots amplifying the oppressive stillness. It was as if the forest had swallowed every sound, leaving only my ragged breaths to echo in the void. I never should have come on this stupid camping trip. I whispered to myself, crouched in the damp darkness, my ears straining for any sound. My chest felt tight, each breath shallow and quick, as though fear itself was suffocating me. My palms were clammy, gripping the cool bark of a nearby tree for some semblance of stability. The weight of regret pressed heavily on me, coiling with the gnawing sense that I was being watched. Something was out there, lurking beyond the thin veil of pine trees. It had taken Eric's dad, and now it was hunting us. The cold seeped through my jacket, clinging to my skin like a second, unforgiving layer. Every sound, the creak of a branch, the whisper of wind, seemed amplified, distorted, as if the forest itself were alive and complicit in our terror. Back then, it was just supposed to be a fun weekend. Eric, Peter, Jason, Robert, and me, Charlie, just kids from Millbrook Middle School, chasing adventure in the Adirondacks. I felt a mix of excitement and unease. Part of me craved the thrill, while another part whispered warnings I couldn't quite shake. Mr. Larson, Eric's dad, had promised us a real wilderness experience. No phones, no distractions, just survival. The idea sounded adventurous to Eric and the others, but to me, it felt like we were walking into something we didn't fully understand. "This is going to be awesome," Eric had said, his blonde mop bouncing as he grinned ear to ear. "Dad's got the best campsite in the state picked out. We'll build fires, go fishing, maybe even spot some deer." Even then, I felt the first pangs of doubt. Something about leaving behind the safety of home gnawed at me. But I caved to the group's excitement. After all, how bad could it be? By the time we piled into Mr. Larson's SUV, the world outside was a blaze of fall colors. I watched the leaves swirl in the crisp wind, their reds and golds vivid against the backdrop of the deepening forest. It should have been beautiful, but all I could feel was a growing unease. The vibrant scenery felt like a cruel mask, hiding the shadows that seemed to stretch longer with every mile we drove. My stomach twisted, a quiet dread gnawing at the edges of my excitement. The crisp air carried the faint scent of wood smoke, and the sound of leaves crunching under our boots lingered as we loaded our gear. Rays of sunlight pierced through the golden canopy, casting long, jagged shadows that danced as we drove. For a moment, it felt like the perfect autumn day, but with every mile deeper into the forest, the warmth of those colors faded into the cold embrace of the wilderness. The Adirondacks stretched out before us, an endless sea of fiery reds and golds, but the deeper we drove into the wilderness, the more muted the colors became, swallowed by the thickening trees. By Friday afternoon, we were miles deep into the forest. Mr. Larson led the way, a machete slicing through the underbrush as we trudged behind. The deeper we went, the darker it got. Eric called it atmosphere. I called it oppressive. The air grew damp, heavy with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. The occasional snap of a twig or distant bird call punctuated our silence, but even those sounds began to feel unnatural. "It's just nature, guys," Mr. Larson reassured, but even he was glancing over his shoulder. His cheerful demeanor seemed forced, his laughter too loud in the oppressive quiet. I noticed the tension in his jaw and the way his grip tightened on the machete he carried. It wasn't like him to show nerves, and that only made the creeping unease settle deeper into my chest. The others seemed to sense it too. Eric's smile faltered, replaced by a nervous fidget as he adjusted the straps on his backpack. Jason shifted his weight from foot to foot, his gaze darting to the shadows under the trees. Even Robert, the ever-logical one, stopped joking, his face pale as he scanned the trail ahead. By nightfall, things already felt off. Eric paced nervously near the edge of the firelight, muttering half-hearted comments about how cool the setting was, though his voice lacked conviction. Jason sat cross-legged, fidgeting with the stick he'd been whittling, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a noticeable tension. "Feels like the woods are watching us," he said, barely above a whisper, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Robert attempted to break the heavy silence with a joke, but his laugh came out brittle and hollow. Even Mr. Larson seemed distant, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the trees, his jaw clenched as though bracing for something he couldn't name. The oppressive quiet wrapped around us, turning every flicker of the fire into a shadow that seemed to crawl closer. The usual forest noises had vanished, replaced by an unsettling quiet that pressed on our eardrums like a tangible weight. Eric's earlier enthusiasm had waned, his chatter reduced to uneasy glances toward the shadowy treetops. Jason, usually so calm, fidgeted with the hem of his jacket, muttering about how the firelight didn't seem to reach far enough. Robert tried to fill the silence with jokes, but his voice cracked with every punchline. Even Mr. Larson, our fearless guide, sat unusually still, his eyes scanning the dark as though expecting something to emerge. It was as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting. The usual forest noises faded, leaving an eerie silence that seemed to echo our every step. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the towering trees. Robert, ever the skeptic, joked about ghost stories, but his voice lacked conviction. On the second night, it happened. We were gathered around the fire when a blood-curdling scream tore through the woods. "Stay here!" Mr. Larson barked, grabbing his flashlight and knife. He vanished into the trees, leaving us frozen in terror. The minutes stretched into hours. The fire died down, its embers glowing faintly as we sat in silence. Then his scream echoed back. It was a sound I'll never forget, a mixture of pain and something else, something primal. We found him near the edge of a ravine, or rather, we found what was left of him, scattered like discarded remnants of a violent nightmare. The air was thick with the metallic stench of blood, mingling with the sharp, acrid smell of torn earth. His torn jacket hung loosely from a twisted branch, dark with congealed streaks of red. Around him, the ground bore deep, jagged gouges, as if something massive had dragged him violently to this spot. A swarm of flies buzzed over what remained, their droning hum only amplifying the grotesque stillness. Shadows danced across the scene, almost as if they were alive, mocking our horror. The sight made my stomach churn, and my legs trembled as I fought the urge to collapse. His torn jacket hung loosely from a twisted branch, dark with blood, while deep gouges scored the earth as if something immense had dragged him to his end. The air reeked of copper and decay, and the shadows seemed to deepen, as if they were alive, bearing witness to the carnage. Eric collapsed to his knees, sobbing. "That's not Dad. That's not him anymore," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rushing water below. His flashlight trembled in his hand, illuminating claw marks that scored the trees around us. Something chased us that night. It had Eric's dad's voice, but its movements were wrong, almost fluid. It wasn't human. The shadows around us seemed to stretch and shift, closing in as if hurting us. We ran, heartbeats loud in our ears, but the thing was always just a breath behind. Peter tripped first. His scream cut short as the shadows swallowed him. Then Jason. Each loss tightened the grip of terror around us. Eric's desperation turned to fury and he screamed into the void, "Come for me, you bastard!" It did. Eric was ripped away from us, his cries echoing long after he vanished into the darkness. Finally, it was just Robert and me. We found the old, hollow tree just as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Robert clung to his anomaly tracker, muttering about energy readings and dimensional tears. His voice trembled with fear and awe. "This isn't just a monster, Charlie. It's something else. Something wrong." "You're not crazy," I whispered, forcing myself to breathe. "It's real." As the first rays of sunlight pierced the clearing, the thing outside the tree dissolved, its inhuman shrieks drowned by the light. But by then, Eric was gone too, We stumbled back to civilization, changed, haunted by the whispers of the forest. Months later, I still hear Eric's voice in my dreams. It's always the same, a trembling, desperate whisper, as though he's caught somewhere just out of reach. His words crawl under my skin, laden with fear and sorrow. "Charlie, it's not over." When I wake, my chest tightens with a mix of grief and dread, the echoes of his voice reverberating through my mind like a haunting melody I can't escape. It's always the same, a trembling, desperate whisper, as though he's caught somewhere just out of reach. His words crawl under my skin, laden with fear and sorrow. "Charlie, it's not over." When I wake, my chest tightens with a mix of grief and dread, the echoes of his voice reverberating through my mind like a haunting melody I can't escape. "Charlie, it's not over," he says, his face pale, eyes wide. "It's still hunting. It wants us all." I've never gone back to the woods, but I know someday I will, because it's not over. Not yet. And when the time comes, I'll be ready to face whatever is lurking out there, waiting for its toll. Even now, the memories linger like a shadow I can't shake. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle outside my window makes my heart race. I see Eric in every corner of my dreams, his face a mixture of terror and pleading. And the forest, those endless whispering trees, calls to me in my quiet moments, daring me to return. I've tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the scratches on my arms, the scars across my memories, say otherwise. Someday I'll go back. Not because I'm brave, but because I have to. Because if I don't, it will come for me, for Robert, for everyone else it marked that night. The woods don't forget, and neither do I. The Catskill Mountains in New York are stunning. Through their beauty, I am here to tell you that looks can be deceiving. I always enjoyed the drive through the Catskills when I was a kid. My calling to explore the mysterious nature gave me a sense of awe. It was a place I felt true inner peace. Once I could drive myself, I found myself taking consistent weekend camping and ski trips. My excitement for the unknown only grew. I became less fearful and more curious. This was my biggest mistake. I found myself driving into the heart of the mountains in uninhabited areas, camping all alone. This new arrangement worked for a while, and I was happy with the new experience. So I stuck with it. My weekend trips became frequent, and I was camping every week. Now, I don't want to bother you with details, but this story was when I was camping with my friend Frank. Frank and I had been friends in high school and remained friends throughout college. During winter break, we decided we would go on a 3-day camping trip in a new area, the Big Indian Wilderness. There are many urban legends of the Catskills, all of them fake, or so I thought. The biggest urban legend of the area was the Ghoul Hound. This sounds weird. A slim figure that walks on 4 stick-like legs, sharp spines on its back, and a growl that could turn even the bravest of people pale. The worst part about this creature, its face. It was made of 2 ovals that crossed together. Going horizontal were its eyes, going vertical, its mouth of razor-sharp teeth. I had never experienced anything that really scared me in any of my camping trips, even the solo ones. The usual bears and raccoons came and went, usually scavenging for some of my leftover food. I always carried bear mace with me and a variety of knives just in case a bear got a little too curious, but nothing could have prepared me for this trip. I had to stop for gas when we got into a little town outside of the Big Indian Wilderness area. I noticed the cashier of the store staring at me with concern in his eyes, and this set an uneasy feeling inside my whole body. Now, what happened next is, to say the least, cliché. I went to check out, and I decided to ask the cashier if everything was all right. He gave me a weak smile and asked what I would hope he wouldn't. "Are you going into the big Indian wilderness?" he asked. My response of a simple yes made him pale. He went on to explain in vague detail how campers kept disappearing over the last 2 years and that we should just stay at a camping resort to protect ourselves from the ghoul hound. This had Frank and I questioning if we should keep going or not. After a long discussion, we decided yes, we would keep going and enjoy the great outdoors. We weren't going to let a fake urban legend and a creepy cliché gas station cashier ruin our good time. We continued the 20-minute drive to our spot. We picked an empty valley about a 15-minute drive from the Bel Air ski resort. The views were stunning. It was a perfect balance of quiet and close to civilization. The snowy trees coated the land, as if to keep it warm. The wind gently caressed our faces as we set up the tent, racing the light of day. My anxieties of the urban legend gently left my mind as we set up a fire and relaxed. The first night went extremely well. The tent was safe and warm, no animal sounds, and the sky was full of stars. What was strange was the paw prints of what seemed to be an animal with 4 thin legs. This put us on edge again as we both knew how stealthy the ghoul hound was. We knew we couldn't do anything about the prints, so we brushed it aside and left for our ski day. When we came back for the night, our tent was taken apart in a manner so precise that it looked as if a human had done it. Now, remember, we are off in the middle of a forest 15 minutes away from anybody by car. We had no cell service, so this was a big deal. Not a flake of snow fell from the sky that day. The unnerving part was, there were no human footprints, only more of the thin paw prints that had appeared overnight. Unfortunately, we had arrived with only 30 minutes of daylight left. This bad timing on our part made us make the decision on setting the tent back up and staying the night. We decided against lighting a fire and staying in our tent the entire night. It was around midnight when we were startled awake by the noise. A horrible, tormenting noise. We looked at each other with horror. What we were hearing was what we were warned about by the cashier and what most likely took down our tent earlier in the day. This was no doubt its growl. I shot up, grabbing my bear maze within what was probably less than a second. Frank shot up slowly. I could tell I was having a fight and he was having a freeze reaction. We sat silently, not breathing for what felt like hours. I checked the time, 12:15. We waited another minute, starting to believe we were just dreaming. That was until the zipper to our tent started to unzip as the sound of breathing hovered over the tent. The zipper slowly continued down the track as if it knew what it was doing and was trying to taunt us. I grabbed my largest knife and got ready for what could be the end. The zipper ripped off its tracks and the rift stretched open. The only thing I could see was the darkness of the night. What was unusual was that the stars and moon were gone. I anticipated whatever it was to stick its horrifying face inside of the tent. But it didn't. This game went on for another 4 hours. We sat frozen, wondering if we last to see the sunrise through the horrors of the night. As the sunrise brought a red sky, we remained unable to see the creature. Finally, we heard the growl it's infamous for. The creature came from behind the tent, leaped over it, and landed facing us. Its face was warped by a sinister look in its eyes. We knew when we saw it that this creature had a lust for blood. I was not trying to become a statistic, so my next decision still shocks me to this day. I am not a large guy, I have always had a skinny build. I ran cross-country throughout high school, and I always hated football. Anyways, I found myself sprinting at this long, skinny, but tall creature. I attempted to tackle the creature knowing it would be the only way I saw the light of the new day's sun. I ran into the creature and managed to knock it down. It got up menacingly with a wide smirk across its cross-shaped face. Frank arose from the tent with an axe, and we knew this was about to be the fight of our lives. The ghoul hound stood up on its two hind legs. This thing was a lot larger than expected. It rose to about 9 feet tall. It ran towards us, and I got a maze spray right into its eyes. It wiped away the thick coating of what would put a human into a state of excruciating pain and smacked me across the face. As I drifted into a state of unconsciousness, a similar fate struck Frank. I was knocked out. I woke up bound, being dragged deeper into the woods. There was a whole group of ghoul hounds assisting the one that we had just fought in, carrying us back. We were going to be breakfast if we didn't think fast. I felt a stabbing pain in my pocket and realized that I had my Swiss Army knife in my pocket. I managed to bend in a way that looked natural, and I was able to grab my knife. I slowly and inconspicuously whittled away at my ropes. I freed my legs and one arm, and I went to assist Frank. He was dazed and half awake, but I managed to free both of us completely. I shot up, ready to fight again, when I noticed something sickening. At least 25 precisely disassembled bodies of victims were put together in a mixed and matched puzzle-like way. The ghoul hounds froze. They stared me down, and in a terrifying set of raspy, deep voices they said in unison, "These two have managed to wake and free themselves. They have earned their freedom." They waved their hands around and we both passed out again. We woke up later in the day. My phone was dead, but the sun's position showed it was around 1 in the afternoon. We were right near our car and our camping gear was packed perfectly back to the way we packed it before we left for our trip. My keys were already inserted and the car was started. Our fuel tank had been filled. I drove my crappy car out of there at speeds faster than I thought any car could do. When we got back to civilization in the foothills, we immediately went to a police station and told them what happened. The surprised look on the officer's face as we told him what we saw proved that he had heard this story before. He went on to explain that this was a normal report that they get around once every 2 or 3 months. As we left the police station, we saw the ghoul hounds waiting. They hid their slim bodies behind the trees, but it seemed as if they wanted us to recognize their presence. This is why you should never go camping in the Catskills unless you're at a resort. We drove the 2-hour drive home in complete silence except for the gasps of terror when we saw them appear on the side of the road. I went straight back to my parents' house after I dropped Frank off. I was greeted warmly and questioned about the early arrival, but I knew they wouldn't believe my story. I told them that some food we brought was spoiled and we were feeling sick, so they would stop asking. All night, I heard taps on my bedroom window. I woke up in the late morning to my parents screaming at the sight of the ghoul hound. I write this knowing they are nearby. I have hired ghost hunters and exorcists, but nothing seems to work. I can't tell if they're sinister or innocent, but they seem to respect me for escaping. Whatever they are, I saw what they did to the people that didn't wake up and escape. This is my warning to trust the cliché gas station employee and your gut. Don't go camping anywhere in the Catskills unless you stay at a resort. This has been my warning. Come prepared if you choose to disregard it. I like to go to the beach for a couple days every year. Any more than a weekend, I get tired of the beach because I burn to a crisp so easily. Anyway, this summer, I've been begging my boyfriend to go for a weekend, but money is so tight. He wouldn't come with me, so I decided to go with a friend. Now, my friend likes to drink and stay drunk, and I can't drink much due to medical reasons. So my fun beach weekend turned into her going off to get drunk and hook up with guys, while I roamed the beaches and the boardwalk myself. I took a bus to the other end of the city to do some exploring. I visited shops and private beaches all day and treated myself to a massage. Folk, my friend, and her drinking. I was going to enjoy myself no matter what. After being on the bus and relaxing at the massage parlor for a couple hours, I decided to roam the beach again. I became restless and needed a walk. I ended up on a private beach with almost no condos along it. To my right was a pretty high cliff, so I was very surprised when I saw people jumping off of it. I thought that jumping from that height would hurt significantly and possibly cause injury. I had looked up in time to see someone falling down into the water, so I sat down in the sand to watch. But then I realized they weren't jumping. They were being pushed. 3 guys grabbed another by the arms and shoulders and heaved him off the edge of the cliff. I got up and hid behind some boulders, hoping they didn't see me. The last thing I wanted was to end up being pushed into the water myself. I wasn't a very good swimmer, as it was let alone with the waves rising up and down. I peeked out from behind the boulder trying to figure out these guys' vantage point, still hoping they couldn't see me. While I was concentrating on what the men's next move was, I heard a scream near where the other men had been pushed into the water. I quickly looked over as I was hearing a huge splash, instinctively crouching lower to the ground behind the boulder. My eyes locked onto a spurt of blood and water gushing out from whatever had made the splash, as the man that screamed was backstroking away from the horrific scene. My eyes missed what made the splash, but the first man that had hit the water was gone. The second one had reached a boulder and was trying to climb out of the water. He didn't have anywhere else to go. The men at the top of the cliff were peering down, not doing anything but watching and waiting to see what happened to the men they pushed. All of a sudden, before anyone had time to react, out of the water near the boulder where the other man was climbing upon came a huge, black, sleek head. Almost faster than I could blink, jaws snapped onto the man and pulled him into the water. Blood turned the water surrounding the boulder red. There was no splash this time. Horrified, I looked up to the men on top of the cliff again. They seemed just as shocked as I was, which is strange considering they just committed murder. They were still waiting to see what would happen next. I kept glancing from them and back to the water. I didn't know what I should do, but I was too horrified to move. On a glance to the water, I saw ripples. Whatever had eaten those men was swimming near the surface, approaching the beach. Closer and closer it swam to the shallows, and, still frozen, I watched as it climbed out of the water near the base of the cliff. It appeared to be 40 feet long. Sleek black skin stretched taut over a frame similar to a Komodo dragon. A long paddle-like tail made up half its body length. I wasn't sure how it was able to swim efficiently with its legs bent like they were. Once it was out of the water, it stopped and sniffed the air. It threw its head back and pointed its nose straight up, showing off its sharp needle teeth hanging out of its jaw. It looked up at the cliff and then looked over to the boulder I was hiding behind. The men at the top of the cliff followed its gaze. I had been spotted by both the monster and the group of men. Obviously, picking the easier choice, the sea dragon started toward me. I had nowhere to go except starting to run as fast as I could away from it. I glanced over my shoulder and noticed, thanking the Lord, that this thing was pretty clumsy on land. Its tail made it too heavy to move fast, and it wasn't built for moving on sand. Unfortunately, neither was I. Realizing that it wasn't going to catch me by running after me, it darted back into the water. Still running, I watched to my right as ripples in the water indicated that it was following me through the water at a much faster pace than I was running. I kept running and keeping an eye on it, but it swam farther up past me. I realized instantly what it was doing. It was planning on coming out of the water onto the sand ahead of me to block me. There was no way I was going to let that happen, so I cut perpendicularly to the trajectory I was already on. I started running in the direction of the town where the restaurants and shops were. Behind me, about 50 feet up from where I would have ended up, the monster had climbed out of the water. It saw that I had changed course and was farther away than it had anticipated. It narrowed its eyes and slid back into the water, turning around to watch me like an alligator would watch its prey. Figuring I was safe, I was able to slow down and take a bit of a breather. Glancing back one last time, I saw that the dragon was still watching me, needle teeth bared in a snarl. I imagined it must be pretty pissed that it didn't catch me. Stopping for just a moment, I swung my backpack around and pulled out a solid chocolate lighthouse that I'd just bought at the candy store before hitting the beach. I unwrapped the candy and threw it as far as I could toward the water. Swimming back toward the shore and nostrils flaring, the dragon slithered out of the water to examine the candy. It stuck out a snaky tongue and licked at it. It must have liked it because it picked it up and started back toward the water, reminding me of my dog when he picks up a bone and runs off with it to hide and chew it in peace. After the dragon was gone, just to be safe, I started running toward the town again. I didn't know what to do about the men on the cliff, so I did the only thing I knew I could. I went back to the candy store where I bought the chocolate lighthouse and called the police and told them about the men pushing others into the water, and all the blood I saw when they hit the rocks. I omitted the part about the sea monster, highly doubting they would believe me on that account. Everyone is gone. I still can't believe it is happening. This is my second day on vacation. My wife and kids are gone. There is no one else here at the resort. I'm going to post this here and hope someone can help me understand what is going on. We arrived in Florida yesterday and everything was great. It was 80 degrees, a big difference from the rain and 30 degrees temperature we left behind in Michigan that morning. Our room was all ready when we got there, which was great. We went into our room to check it out and they had given us a handicapped, accessible room. We didn't need it, but that must have been what was available. It was 2 floors with the bedrooms upstairs and a nice big kitchen and living room area on the main floor. When we dropped off our luggage in the room, my 2 daughters ran around to explore it. "Dad," my 10-year-old shouted, "there's an elevator in here." My 8-year-old ran over to her, and they were both laughing and jumping up and down. "This is so cool," she said. I went in there with them, and we rode it up to the 2nd floor. My wife was up there cleaning the surfaces and handles, and I knew that the elevator was going to get a lot of use from them, and likely me too. After a couple rides in the elevator, we changed into our bathing suits and headed down to the lazy river. This was my favorite place to stay on Vacation. It never seemed too busy, the water was warm, and there were so many activities for my kids. After a great start to our vacation, we headed to our room and crashed in bed. The next morning, I was the first to wake. I checked on everyone else, and since they were still sleeping, I quietly went down the stairs and outside. It was peaceful outside, and I only saw a few people on my walk to the marketplace for breakfast, sandwiches, and coffee. When I got back to our room, I could hear that everyone was awake, so I took the elevator up. It made a loud ding when it reached the 2nd floor and the doors opened up to silence. There was a small hallway where the elevator was and a bedroom on each side of it. "I've got breakfast," I said. When there was no response and still only silence, I figured they were hiding on me. I looked in each room and the bathrooms, but no one was there. I thought they must have gone down the stairs when I was coming up, so I went down and looked in the kitchen and living area. The rafts and bags we always took to the pool were still there, as well as my wife's sunglasses. "Hello?" I called out, to still no response. I pushed the elevator button and thought maybe they were hiding in there, but the empty car proved me wrong. I looked on the patio and then went outside. The sun was about 45 degrees up in the sky and there was no breeze, making it feel warmer than the 60-degree temperature of the morning. I walked down the path by the lake towards the pool, looking out at the golf course along the way. There was no one holding that I could see, but only a couple of the holes were visible. The green light flashed when I scanned my bracelet to the sensor on the gate. I went into the pool area, which was usually pretty quiet at this time in the morning. People would soon slowly trickle in and begin saving chairs in a little while, At least on a normal day they would. I walked around looking for my family and didn't saw a few chairs with folded towels on them. None of the cabanas were taken yet, so I grabbed a few towels and put them in our usual one for when I finally could find them. No one else was at around the pool. I knew they had to be somewhere nearby, so I went back to the cabana, sat in a lounge chair, and texted my wife to let her know where I was. The peacefulness of the morning was calming, even though I was getting nervous that something was wrong. I closed my eyes for a moment and must have drifted off to sleep. When I opened my eyes again, the sun was directly overhead. I checked my watch and it was 11:40 a.m. My phone was lying next to me, so I unlocked it and did not see any missed texts or calls. The cabanas around me were still empty, and so were the chairs by the pool. It was way too quiet without the usual noises of kids splashing and playing in the water. Once again, I walked around and still didn't see anyone at all. Even the bar was empty, where there should have at least been a few customers and a worker. I went into the lobby, and no one was behind the check-in desks. There were a couple suitcases behind one of them. When I walked around the rest of the property without still seeing anyone, I was finally certain that something was seriously wrong. I tried calling my wife, but my phone just showed calling on the screen and there was no ringing or any sounds. After a while, the call failed and it went back to my home screen. I opened up my web browser and tried to go on a few sites. Everything took a long time to load, and only some sites would work, but most just kept trying to load without anything appearing on the screen. I'm sitting in a cabana now and started taking some videos and pictures of the place to document this. The emails I've sent are all coming back as undeliverable, and I've been unable to communicate with anyone at all. The videos have been glitchy, so I'm going to take some more, and I'll try to post them later. The pictures I took have been unsettling to look at. I'm not sure if I'm seeing things in them or if it is just my imagination. I added them to the end of this list, and I think the links are working for them. I'm not expecting any responses, but this is one of the last places I can think to try, and one of the few sites that are working. I've begun hearing strange noises in the distance, and I'm so lost on what to do. There are 2 other hotels on this property that are a short walk away. One of them I can see from here, but haven't seen any activity there either. I guess maybe I should walk over there after I post this, just in case there is someone else over there. When I come back, I hope to see some responses that help me shed some light on what is happening, or at least show me I am not alone. I walked down the stone pathway, past the empty tennis courts and over to the next hotel. There were water slides there, and the water was running down them, but no one was there either. I tried taking videos of it, but my camera would crash or the video would glitch. I'll post the best one I was able to get at the end of this update. It was surreal walking through the huge pool area, which also had a lazy river with no one else around. The current was flowing, and there were some empty tubes going around it. Most of the chairs were empty, but there were some with the hotel towels laid out nicely on them. I looked across the bridge that went across the lake to the golf course, and of course, that was empty too. There were a couple golf carts out on the grass, and I think I saw a few golf bags lying in the grass, but they were far away, so it was hard to tell for sure. I didn't feel like going there yet. I wanted to check out the hotels first. This hotel had a huge lobby, a couple restaurants, and shopping. There was some luggage sitting by the front desk, and there was food on some of the tables at the restaurant. The rest of the hotel was pretty much the same. There were no windows in this area, so I didn't realize it was getting late until I looked at my watch and saw that it was almost 6 o'clock at night. I had wanted to be back in my room before dark, but that wasn't going to happen now. I went back through the hotel and outside to the pool area. Luckily, the lights along the pathway were on to illuminate my way back. It sounded like something was moving across the small lake, but it was too dark to tell what it was. I picked up my pace and moved ahead. As I got closer to the entrance to the townhouse area, I heard footsteps ahead of me on the path. I took a picture and then a video and saw something this time. It ran into the bushes and disappeared from my sight while making disturbing sounds. After waiting a bit, I went ahead and took the path to my room. I heard something coming from the parking lot way ahead of me. It sounded like it was moving fast. I took off running and scanned my bracelet to the door. It seemed to take forever for the green lights to show, and it sounded like something was scraping along the stone path behind me. Finally, the door opened, and I slammed it shut behind me. The automatic lock engaged, and I pushed the manual lock for added security. Then I backed away from the door as something slammed against it. I thought about how someone had commented that maybe I went to a different reality or dimension or something, and ran to the elevator. The pounding against the door continued. I pushed the elevator call button and heard the gears start moving. It sounded like the door and wall were breaking with each additional crash against it. The loud ding of the elevator finally sounded, and the door slid open. I ran inside and pressed the number 2 button over and over. Then I heard the door slam against the wall and something run across the floor with thundering footsteps. As the door slid closed, I caught a glimpse of a jagged human-like shape covered in what looked like thick black fog. It crashed into the door and the elevator shook, making me stumble into the wall. The elevator started moving as the crashing continued. I held on to the bar on the side and hoped the elevator would make it up. Although I wasn't sure what I would do when I got to the second floor. My only hope would be to run down the stairs and outside before that thing got up here. There was a huge crash below me, and my head slammed into the wall, making me dizzy. I closed my eyes and steadied myself before the loud ding sounded again and the doors slid open. I heard footsteps running towards me, and I opened my eyes to see my daughter standing there. "Come on, Dad, let's go down to the pool," she shouted before running down the stairs. I slowly got out of the elevator and looked around. My wife and other daughter were in one of the bedrooms packing things into a bag for the pool. My wife saw me and said, "Hurry up and get changed. We're wasting valuable pool time." I went down the stairs and saw that the door was closed and there was no damage to it or the wall around it. I looked at my watch and it was 9:30 in the morning. I was exhausted and very confused, but I got changed and went with my family to the pool. We passed by a few people on the way, and there were some people sitting on the chairs drinking coffee. When we got to a cabana, I sat down and checked my phone. The pictures and videos I had taken were still there. I fell asleep in the chair for a while when my family went into the lazy river. My dreams were filled with the thing I saw by the elevator and the things from my pictures. When I woke up, I didn't see anyone at first, and was afraid everyone disappeared again. Then a couple of kids ran past me towards the water slides, and I felt relieved. I took some good pictures around the pool and was able to relax and enjoy the nice sunny day. However, my enjoyment didn't last when I reviewed the pictures after I climbed into bed for the night. I think I brought something back with me from wherever I went. My dad and I were going camping for a weekend just to spend some time together. This was last year, and it was my first year of college. Everything was stressing me out, and since we'd gone camping together a few times in the past, my dad was nice enough to take some time off and bring me out. The campsite was 2 hours away, so the sparse trees turned gradually into deep, deep forest. While we followed the road as it wound through canyons and around mountainsides, I remember thinking how awesome the density of the trees was. I mean, you couldn't see beyond a few feet. It was just like the movies, and I never remembered seeing the density like this. We got to the campsite feeling cramped and happy to be in fresh air. Together, we pitched the tent first and set up our sleeping bags so it would be ready for us when we were tired. Since we had left so early in the day, it was still light out, so we took the truck and drove to the nearby lake to throw in some bait and just hang out. No one else was there since it was a weekday. That meant we didn't have to fight for a spot or hike halfway around the lake to settle in. We walked to a ledge just off a trail that was near the road, set down our camping chairs, and set up our fishing gear. Dad's into audiobooks, so he pulled out a speaker and put on a mystery novel. We'd talk occasionally, but having the book on play helped us feel like we were connecting without being forced to find topics of conversation. We still had all weekend. We took turns walking the trail a ways, seeing what was further along the lake. The forest was behind us and sloped uphill after a little while. The whole lake was inside a bowl surrounded by hills and mountains. It was seriously beautiful. As the sun was getting close to setting on the bowl, a long, drawn-out booming moan echoed across the lake. It was sudden, too. Silence, then moaning. It lasted for several seconds before abruptly stopping. The echo made it impossible to identify where it had come from. The moan bounced back and forth around the bowl, lasting 2 seconds longer than the actual sound had been. My dad hit the pause button immediately and we stared at each other. First scared, then confused. The best I can describe it is the sound of a whale in pain, only above the water and very, very loud. The sound was deep, too, so deep that it pressed noticeably on my eardrums. Something big had compressed and released all the air in the entire valley. I asked my dad what that noise was, and he just shook his head. We waited for a few more seconds, cocking our heads and subconsciously prompting whatever it was to make a noise again so we could identify it. When nothing happened, we both chuckled at each other and joked about it. My heart was still pounding pretty hard, but I began to relax. We reeled in our hooks and started putting everything away. I was arranging everything in the tackle box when the booming moan came again. I watched everything in the box make a noticeable jump, as if a gust of wind had swept across the whole box. I remember looking up at my dad, wondering what sound could do that, and I saw him looking out over the lake. I managed to turn around with enough time to see something big sink below the tree line across the lake. It was a lighter color, though I'm not sure what color I would describe it being. The trees around it all swayed heavily, looking like they might fall over. But they didn't. They just swung back and forth after being disturbed. Another booming moan, this one causing actual ripples in the lake. Small, short ripples, like placing sand on a speaker plate and watching it dance while a song played. Except the plate was the size of a lake, and the entire surface was disturbed. The sound must have been partially below our hearing range, because if not, it's a miracle our eardrums didn't burst. Without even discussing it, we threw everything into the tackle box and walked quickly to the truck. We were both on edge, looking over our shoulder at the edge of the lake and waiting to see if anything else would appear. Another truck was pulling into the lot as we put our poles into the trunk. Seeing someone else calmed us both a little, and I could tell my dad was relieved to not have to be the complete adult authority now. It was 2 guys coming to fish, both older than my dad. They caught us looking at them and nodded. We nodded back, realizing that we were staring with wide eyes. I jumped when the boom sounded again. You could hear the water churning under the strain. My dad jumped too when it came, and while it was still going on, we got into the truck and started it. The moan ended after we were driving away. The 2 guys who had arrived were putting their stuff back into their truck in a panic. While we drove back to the campsite, I was drumming my fingers on my leg and just feeling a complete panic come over me. I've read since then that some super low-frequency sounds below our hearing range can cause sound-induced panic. I'm convinced that's what was going on. While driving, I thought I heard yet another moan rattle the windows and shake the truck, but that could have been the fear adding that sensation. Our campsite was 10 minutes away, but that's because the roads were winding and the speed limit was slow. We could still see part of the lake from our spot, so we weren't that far from the lake. Dad made the unilateral decision to leave, even though we'd only just arrived. I was fine with that. My heart was racing and wouldn't stop. We rolled up our sleeping bags and tossed them into the truck. Just as we were taking the poles out of the tent, a less intense but still terrifying moan echoed up the mountainside, coming unequivocally from the lake. The echo rattled around the trees for a long time, longer than is natural. Usually, the trees would absorb and dampen it, but the sound just kept rattling around until it wore itself out. If you were floating underwater and took a huge spear and stabbed it into the side of a whale, the water would sound like what we heard. A boom as the water compacted, and a tinge of desperation and pain on the fringes resulting in a higher pitch. And if you were deep and near the floor of the ocean, you'd hear it bounce back at you again, a shadow of the sound but still equally horrifying. We smashed the fabric of the tent together, tossed the whole thing into the truck bed, and got in. Dad went too fast trying to leave. The truck's engine was still too loud to determine if we were still hearing the moan, but the panic that it induced made us unwilling to stick around and investigate. Looking back, I wish we had stayed and investigated, but at the time I was happy just to leave. This is going to be a fairly long story, and it still sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. It all began in the summer of 2010, right before I started 10th grade. My dad had just reconnected with his mom after years of estrangement, and he thought it would be a good idea for me to spend some time with her and get to know her better. That's how I ended up taking a trip with her to the Dominican Republic. At first, I wasn't sure what to expect. I'd heard tales of the island's breathtaking beauty and the warmth of its people. But there was also a lingering unease, an anxious knot in my stomach about the language barrier and being so far from home. Little did I know, what lay ahead was far beyond anything I could have imagined. My dad's Dominican, but I barely spoke Spanish, and my grandmother barely spoke English, so you can imagine the kind of communication issues we had. Despite that, she was amazing. She put me up in a house with a few of my cousins while she stayed a few blocks away, giving me the freedom to explore the island without much supervision. It felt liberating to have so much independence, and it allowed me to experience the culture and landscape in a way that I might not have otherwise. I wandered through vibrant markets where vendors sold tropical fruits I'd never seen before, and I spent afternoons exploring hidden beaches with crystal-clear waters. One time, I joined a group of local kids playing baseball in a dusty field, even though we could barely communicate. Those moments gave me a sense of belonging and showed me a side of the Dominican Republic I never would have known without that freedom. This freedom turned what could have been just another family trip into an unforgettable adventure, albeit one with a few unexpected horrors. Honestly, it was the coolest setup for a teenager. Santo Domingo, where I stayed, was alive with energy. The streets were bustling with people, the aroma of fresh street food filled the air, and music seemed to spill out from every corner. Occasionally, we'd venture out to visit family and friends in other parts of the island. Despite its small size, the Dominican Republic felt vast, with each region offering something different. The long drives gave me time to soak in the scenery, rolling hills, their green peaks veiled in a soft morning mist, palm trees swaying gently against the warm breeze, and the ocean's endless blue expanse sparkling like a field of gemstones under the sun. The rhythmic hum of the car engine mixed with the distant sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves, creating a symphony that felt both calming and surreal. Each turn of the road revealed new vistas, from vibrant wildflowers dotting the roadside to dramatic cliffs plunging into the ocean, leaving me in awe of the island's raw, untouched beauty. One weekend, my cousins Joseph, Ruben, Jonathan, Yania, and I decided to head to Santiago. I'd never been there before, so I jumped at the chance. The drive was a mix of anticipation and awe. As the cityscape of Santo Domingo faded, the highway opened into miles of dense greenery. It was like entering another world. The forest, thick and almost otherworldly, seemed to stretch endlessly, hiding mysteries within its shadows. We arrived late Friday night and stayed in a cabin, a small, rickety structure surrounded by nothing but trees. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. The nearest town was at least 4 to 5 miles away, making it feel like we were entirely cut off from the world. That night, after dinner, we sat in the living room, the dim glow of a single lantern casting long shadows on the wooden walls. Joseph decided to tell us about a local legend, the Gallipotti. It's like our version of Bigfoot or the Chupacabra, he began, leaning in conspiratorially. Supposedly, the Gallipotti is a man who sold his soul to the devil and can shapeshift into any animal. Local tales describe it prowling the forests at night, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness as it stalks unsuspecting travelers. One man claimed he once saw the Gallipotti while walking home from a neighbor's house late at night. He said it appeared as a donkey at first, standing silently in the middle of the path, but when he approached, its body twisted and contorted, transforming into a creature with glowing eyes and sharp, unnatural movements. He ran, but the sound of hoofbeats followed him all the way to his door, only to vanish without a trace when he turned around. It's said that some villagers have heard eerie, inhuman shrieks in the dead of night, or found strange hoofprints leading nowhere. The most terrifying accounts claim that the Gallipotti can mimic human voices to lure its victims deeper into the woods. Joseph's voice dropped as he added, "They usually take the form of donkeys or horses and are drawn to places like this." "Yeah, okay," I said, rolling my eyes. The idea of a shape-shifting demon sounded ridiculous to me. After his story, I called it a night and went to bed around midnight, eager to shake off the eerie atmosphere. At 3 a.m., nature called. I got up to use the bathroom and then started heading back to my room. The cabin was a single-story structure, long like a ranch, with lots of large windows that offered a nearly 360-degree view of the surrounding forest. As I walked down the hallway, I passed one of the biggest windows by the front of the house and froze. A horse was standing at the edge of the woods, its coat unnaturally dark, almost blending with the night. Its eyes, gleaming with a strange intensity, bore into me with an unsettling focus. The surrounding air felt heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, amplifying the eerie silence. It wasn't grazing or moving, just unnervingly still. Its dark eyes seemed to pierce through me, locking me in place. "What the hell?" I muttered, rubbing my eyes, hoping I was just tired and seeing things. But when I looked again, it was still there, staring. My heart raced as I bolted back to my room, every nerve in my body screaming with panic. My breaths came in short, shallow gasps, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I shook Jonathan awake, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what I'd just seen. "You're not going to believe this," I stammered, my words spilling out in a rush of fear and urgency. He was skeptical but got up to check with me. When we returned to the window, the horse was back. Only this time it was closer to the cabin. "What the?" Jonathan whispered, his face pale. That was enough for me. I went into full red alert mode, waking everyone else in the cabin. When they came to the window, though, the horse was gone. "You're probably just seeing things," Yania said, annoyed at being woken up. I was starting to think they might be right when we all heard it. A shriek. This wasn't a normal animal sound. It was a mix between a horse's neigh and a cat's scream, piercing and unnatural. We all froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I ran back to the window in my room, and there it was again. The horse. But this time, it was levitating. I'm not exaggerating when I say that thing was suspended in the air. I could only see its front legs and part of its body. The rest was obscured by the darkness of the forest. My breath caught in my throat as everyone else crowded around me, their eyes wide with terror. The horse slowly backed into the woods, its movements unnaturally smooth, and then it disappeared into the shadows. None of us slept that night. I stayed by the window until the sun came up, watching for any sign of the creature. When morning came, we packed our stuff and left. We'd planned to stay the entire weekend, but there was no way we were sticking around after that. We ran out of supplies. We told our family back in Santo Domingo. None of us mentioned the horse. Even now, years later, I'm still haunted by what we saw. That experience has forever changed my perspective on the supernatural. Before that night, I dismissed folklore as mere stories meant to entertain or scare, but now I see them as a window into fears and mysteries that may hold some truth. The thought of how many other legends could be rooted in reality sends chills down my spine. Stories like the Gallipote feel less like fiction and more like a warning, a reminder that the unknown is out there, watching. That night changed the way I think about folklore. I used to dismiss it as just stories, but now I can't help but wonder if there's more truth to these tales than we're willing to admit. The memory of that horse, its piercing eyes and otherworldly presence, lingers in my mind. I'd love to visit DR again, but Santiago? Hell no. I'll stick to the capital, where the chances of seeing a levitating horse are basically zero. I've always believed the forest was a sanctuary, a place where you could lose yourself in the beauty of nature and find peace in its quietude. As a child, I'd spend hours exploring trails, letting the whispers of the trees guide me deeper into their embrace. My girlfriend Allie shared this love for the outdoors. She'd often say that the forest felt like home, but that was before the night that changed everything. Now, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind feels like a warning. Whatever we encountered out there, its voice still echoes in my nightmares. "We don't talk to the thing in the woods," Allie warned me. She was right. She always is about these things. We planned a weekend trip to the Mogollon Rim in northern Arizona. It was Allie, my sister Maya and her boyfriend Sam, our friends Amanda and her husband Greg, and me. None of us were survivalists, so we rented a cabin deep in the forest, a place with all the comforts of home, or so we thought. The drive there was long, winding through narrow mountain roads and patches of dense forest. We laughed, played music, and shared stories about past trips as we climbed higher into the wilderness. The man who rented us the cabin left a note with the key. "The septic system was emptied recently. Keep the lights off after 10, you don't want attention." The words struck me as odd, sending a faint chill through my spine. What kind of attention could there be in a place like this? Greg joked. Attention from what? Bigfoot? But his laughter sounded forced in the stillness of the forest. We unloaded our bags and explored the cabin, which was larger and more luxurious than expected. Despite the strange warning, the cozy fireplace and soft beds lulled us into a sense of safety we probably didn't deserve. The first 3 days were idyllic. Hiking by the lake, fishing, sharing stories around the fire, but every so often, a faint rustling came from the trees, too steady to be the wind. At night, the firelight seemed to cast shadows that didn't belong to us, but we chalked it up to exhaustion and our imaginations. The woods around the cabin were stunning, filled with towering pines and the scent of earth and pine sap. On the fourth day, most of us tackled a grueling 6-hour trail, leaving Maya and Sam at the cabin. They weren't big on hiking and preferred to relax indoors. That night, we returned exhausted but exhilarated, sharing pictures and stories over dinner. By 10 p.m., we'd all agreed to turn off the lights as the note suggested. It felt like a harmless nod to local superstition. But at 2:30 a.m., a frantic knock shattered my sleep, cutting through the silence like a blade. The sound wasn't just loud. It carried a tremor of panic, like the person behind it was fighting to hold on to their last shred of hope. Each knock seemed to reverberate through the cabin walls, echoing in my chest with a sense of impending doom. "Hello? I'm lost. Please, I need help," a man's voice called. I sat up, but Allie gripped my shoulder with trembling fingers. Her face was ashen, her lips pressed tightly together as if holding back a scream. Her wide eyes darted between me and the door, brimming with panic and unshed tears. "Don't answer. Don't speak," she whispered, her voice barely audible yet weighted with fear. The knocking stopped, but then something tapped on our window. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like fingers drumming on the glass. Allie pulled me close, pressing her lips to mine to keep me from looking. "It knows we're here now," she murmured. "It'll come back." The next morning, Amanda and Greg dismissed our fears. "Probably just some lost hiker," Greg scoffed, shaking his head. Maya, however, was livid. "You're jumping at shadows because Allie had a bad dream?" she snapped, clearly annoyed. Sam sided with her, calling the whole thing a case of overactive imaginations. Allie remained quiet until we were alone. Then she confessed, "My grandfather warned me about the thing in the woods. It took my father. I heard him calling for us after he was gone." She told me stories of her childhood, of whispered warnings about a creature that mimicked voices to lure its victims. Her grandfather had always been adamant. Never speak to it, never acknowledge it. Allie recalled a chilling night from her childhood when her family had camped near the woods. Late in the evening, they'd heard her father's voice calling for help from the trees, though he was seated right beside them. Her grandfather had pulled her close, muttering, "It's testing us. Ignore it." The voice grew angrier, louder, until finally fading into the night. The next morning, they found claw marks etched deep into the trees around their campsite. "It doesn't like to be ignored," she said, her voice trembling. That night, the knocking returned. "Hello? I saw your light. Can you help?" Sam, irritated by our earlier caution, stormed to the door despite my protests. "You left the light on for me," a distorted voice hissed as he opened the door. A horrific scream followed, piercing and unnatural. The house shook with inhuman snarls and tearing sounds. Shadows flickered wildly as something moved with impossible speed. Greg grabbed his rifle, firing into the chaos. Each shot rang out like a thunderclap, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. "Stay back," he yelled, his voice cracking with fear as the echoes of the gunfire mixed with guttural snarls. The sharp metallic tang of blood and the sickly stench of decay seeped through the room, making it hard to breathe. But the thing mimicked their voices, calling to us in chilling mockery. It used Sam's voice first, then Maya's. The words were wrong, flat, devoid of emotion, but horrifyingly familiar. Allie and I barricaded ourselves in the bedroom as the cacophony outside turned to silence. We held our breath as footsteps approached the door. "Hey, let's go," Greg's voice said, knocking on the door. "It's safe now." But we knew better. The thing splintered the door, revealing its monstrous form, a grotesque amalgamation of wood and rot, with glowing eyes that seemed alive with malice. Its limbs were twisted and gnarled, like ancient branches, and the air around it stank of decay. Allie dragged me out through the window, and we sprinted to the car. As we sped down the forest road, I saw it standing at the tree line, its twisted silhouette etched against the moonlight. Its voice followed us. "We'll see you again." 2 years later, Allie and I live far from any forest, but the memories cling to me like thorns embedded in flesh. Sometimes I wake drenched in sweat, the phantom sound of Greg's scream tearing through my dreams. I hear the rustle of leaves when there is no wind, or faint whispers that echo through the silence of the desert nights, each one calling my name with an eerie familiarity. Just as Allie's warnings echo in my mind, so too do the haunting images, the twisted limbs, the malevolent glow of its eyes, and the stench of rot that seemed to seep into my very skin. The thing we encountered may be miles away, but it feels as though it's still watching, still waiting. We don't talk to the thing in the woods, I remind myself, clutching onto the fragile peace we've tried to build. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear Greg or Maya calling my name. The voices are faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. The weight of their absence and the horror of their last moments press down on me, suffocating in their intensity. I don't look, I don't answer. We don't talk to the thing in the woods. The vast wilderness had always called to me, a siren song of adventure and solitude that few could resist. The rolling mountains and dense forests of southwest Montana always felt vast and isolating. The crisp scent of pine filled the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of damp soil, while a cold breeze seemed to cut through every layer, chilling me to the bone. They whispered solitude louder than any place I'd been, second only to Alaska during my Army days. But tonight, this isolation would prove deadly. My name is Ethan Walker, a 34-year-old Montana Highway Patrol officer stationed in Missoula. After 3 years of relentless duty, I had finally earned a 2-week vacation, 14 days of wilderness solitude. Yellowstone was my destination, a chance to rekindle childhood memories amidst rugged beauty. My canine companion, Shadow, a 3-year-old German Shepherd with boundless energy, accompanied me on this long-awaited retreat. Upon arriving at Earthquake Lake Campground, I was met with disappointment. A glitch had double-booked my reserved site. The elderly camp hosts, apologetic and kind, directed me to an unfamiliar place just 10 minutes away, Howling Woods Campground. With no other options, I took their refund and headed to this mysterious site. The campground, shrouded in towering lodgepole pines and a veil of mist, seemed forgotten by time. The air felt heavy, as if carrying centuries of untold secrets. As I knocked on the host's RV, an elderly woman greeted me with a toothless smile. Her voice carried a Native American lilt, and her instructions were strange. "Follow the rules," she said, her tone almost reverent, as if reciting sacred scripture. She handed me a handwritten note, its rules etched in cursive that seemed oddly uneven, as though written in haste or under duress. The paper felt aged, its edges frayed and faintly smelling of smoke, adding to the mystique. Each line of text seemed more like an incantation than a guideline, binding me to something far older and far darker than the camp itself. "Extinguish all fires at dusk. Do not leave your tent after dark. Avoid using light sources if you must step outside. Ignore any noises. Never discuss what you see or hear." Her grip tightened on my wrist as she hissed, "These rules are not suggestions." Her dark, sunken eyes locked onto mine, glowing faintly in the dim light. As if reflecting some hidden flame, the intensity in her gaze felt like it was peeling back layers of my soul, exposing fears I didn't know I had. Her weathered face, etched with deep lines, seemed almost feral, as though she was less human and more a creature born of the wilderness itself. A faint scent of smoke and something metallic clung to her, like the lingering air after a lightning strike, electrifying the space between us. "Break them, and you may not live to regret it," she added, her voice a low growl that resonated deep in my chest. That evening, as I pitched my tent and prepared my campsite, I couldn't shake the eerie vibe of the place. The towering trees seemed to lean closer, their tops swaying gently though the air was still. Shadow sniffed the ground incessantly, ears twitching at every faint rustle. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself hurrying through my routine, a primal instinct urging me to retreat to the safety of the tent. The first night, Shadow's bark jolted me awake. Outside, the darkness pressed against the thin walls of the tent. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out and found Shadow trembling, tail tucked. His reaction set my nerves on edge. Scanning the clearing, I saw nothing, but the oppressive silence was deafening. Even the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures were absent. Then came the howling. Not wolves, not coyotes. These were guttural, mournful cries, unlike anything natural. The sounds circled the camp, growing louder, nearer. They were guttural and layered, like multiple voices tangled in a mournful dirge, each note striking a primal chord of fear. Shadow cowered under the picnic table, trembling uncontrollably, and I bolted back into the tent, locking it with a padlock the host had sold me earlier that day. Even through the tent walls, the howls seemed to vibrate in my chest, unnatural in their resonance, as if echoing from some cavernous abyss. I lay awake, clutching my pistol as the howling faded with the first light of dawn. The next day, I explored the area, hoping to find rational explanations for the night before. The river, the dense pines, and the jagged mountain peaks created an almost surreal beauty, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadow, usually fearless, stayed close to my side, his ears perked and alert. That evening, as I sat by the fire, the host's warning echoed in my mind. I extinguished the flames at dusk and secured all my belongings, double-checking the locks on the tent and bear box. The air grew colder, and a faint mist crept through the trees, swirling unnaturally at the edges of the clearing. I retreated into the tent, determined to avoid breaking any of the rules. On the second night, the howling returned, joined by something more sinister. Heavy footsteps circled the tent, followed by a low, resonant growl. I held Shadow close, his fur bristling. Then, a shadow passed by the tent's fabric wall. Whatever it was massive. My heart raced as the creature's silhouette paused near the entrance. A deep exhale froze my blood. "Follow the rules," the host's voice echoed in my mind, each word dripping with an otherworldly resonance. The heavy silence pressed in, broken only by the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps circling closer. The sound was wet, almost squelching, as if something massive was dragging itself through the undergrowth. Ignoring every survival instinct, I stayed motionless, refusing to look. A low, guttural hum began to vibrate through the air, like the distant toll of a funeral bell, and the steps halted just outside the tent. Minutes felt like hours, until the creature let out a sharp, rasping exhale that sent a jolt through my chest. Only then did the steps retreat into the woods, fading into the oppressive stillness of the night. But the nightmare wasn't over. From the next campsite, I heard a dog's panicked yelps followed by silence. The cries of its owners came next, desperate, pleading. Then, nothing. The following hours were a blur of fear, a disorienting mix of dread and helplessness. The howling came in waves, interspersed with guttural growls and the unmistakable sounds of movement. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, heavy breathing just outside the tent. My mind raced with questions. What was out there? How close was it? Could the thin fabric of the tent truly keep us safe? I clutched Shadow tightly, feeling his trembling body against mine, as if his fear was an extension of my own. Every creak of the trees, every whisper of the wind seemed amplified, each sound stabbing through the fragile veil of safety. I whispered to myself, "Just make it until dawn," over and over, clinging to the thought like a lifeline. Shadow pressed against me, his body trembling. I whispered reassurances, though my own voice shook. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside to a grim scene. Blood and tufts of fur littered the campsite. The neighboring RV was abandoned, its door swinging eerily in the breeze. The host's cryptic warning replayed in my head. This place is ancient, not meant for our kind. Morning brought grim evidence. Blood and tufts of fur littered the campsite. The neighboring RV was abandoned, its door swinging eerily in the breeze. The host's cryptic warning replayed in my head. This place is ancient, not meant for our kind. I packed up and left, the weight of those rules forever etched into my mind. I avoided answering the sheriff's questions when he arrived, claiming I'd slept through the night. He eyed me with suspicion but said nothing more. As I drove through the winding mountain roads, I felt the oppressive weight of the forest lift, though a part of me knew I'd never truly escape the memories of that place. As I drove away, I glanced back at the campground. The host stood at the entrance, her eyes locked on mine. She mouthed 4 words: "Follow the rules, always." To this day, I've never camped overnight again. The mountains still call to me, but their solitude now carries a menacing undertone. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I catch the faintest echo of that mournful, guttural howl. It drifts through the silence like a ghostly reminder, sending chills down my spine and ensuring I never forget the rules of the howling woods. Every snap of a twig, every distant howl reminds me of the howling woods. Some places are better left undiscovered, yet sometimes, late at night, I hear the faintest echo of that guttural howl. It's not nearby, but it's enough to remind me that some places, and their rules, aren't bound by distance or time. On the darkest nights, when the world feels silent and still, I swear I feel the presence of those ancient woods pressing against my mind, whispering their secrets in a language I'll never understand. It's as though the howling woods have marked me, their eerie song lingering in my bones, a haunting melody I'll carry to my grave. Christy, I don't know how to start this letter except to tell you the awful truth. Our sons are dead. I am sitting here alone in the mountain cabin you rented for us, drenched in blood. My hand is shaky and I feel pain in my soul. Our children died by my hand. I have to admit this to you. And once you read this letter fully, you will understand why I had no choice. Someday, you may even find it in your heart to forgive me. But I'm not asking for that right now. Instead, I want you to please read this with an open mind. I know that what I will tell you is going to seem unbelievable, but I swear on my life, on my soul, this is precisely what happened. It may be my last chance to get the facts straight, so I beg of you to read it all the way through and then come to your own conclusions. If not for me, then for the 3 amazing boys we raised together. This is their last testament as well. It made my heart flutter with excitement when you surprised me on my birthday with a weekend getaway to your dad's old cabin. We haven't been there since he passed, and there's been an ache in my bones to go up to the mountains. Plus, the boys had never been at all. The boys have been antsy as well, either due to school or just the stress of life. They had heard about it the last trip, but never had really experienced the mountains like we had. And of course, you knew we all needed a break. The most disappointing thing was when I found out you wouldn't be able to join us. Your mom wanted us to have a boys' trip, enjoy the outdoors unfettered. I knew she also wanted to use the time to be with you. Her health hasn't improved much since Christmas, and I could tell from your phone calls that life-changing discussions would be happening soon. I didn't press the issue or show that I was going to miss you. Instead, I kissed your cheek, squeezed your hand, and promised I would enjoy myself. Even if that was only half true, I made a promise also to myself that I would give it my best. It was easy for my attitude to change when I saw our boys packing. All of them have taken after me with their love of the woods, especially Garrett. Last year, we bought him a crossbow, and he was especially interested in taking it with us and trying it out on a few hawks. I brought some gear as well because I figured this would give me a chance to teach Luke how to fire a gun for the first time in his life. The boy is 8, and honestly, we let his older brothers do this stuff when they were 6. Maybe it's because he is the baby and we are too protective, but I was determined to make this trip special for him. Colt was the only one who didn't seem to have that same enthusiasm about the trip. My guess at the time was that some girl had him wrapped around her finger, and he wasn't keen on being away in the hills without a way to keep in contact. In the past, before your dad died, the cabin was hooked up with Wi-Fi and all the modern amenities, but from what I gathered now, your mom only kept the bare minimum amount of maintenance on the place. This trip felt like we were saying goodbye to a lot of things, if I'm being honest. So that made my resolve to enjoy it even firmer. With fishing gear, hunting knives, bows, and other luggage all loaded in the Tahoe, we were ready to go that Thursday night. Thanks to a school holiday, we had 3 days to enjoy and get lost out in the woods, and weather said it would be clear all the way. It would be a 5-hour drive, and we would drop you off at your mom's house and be at the cabin around noon on Friday. Garrett wanted to leave that same night and hardly slept a wink. He was asking questions about trails, fishing spots, and even found a few caves he wanted to go explore. Even Colt was finally coming around to the idea of it thanks to that attitude. I think the last thing I told you before I waved goodbye at your mom's was that I would call you when I got there. Of course, I entirely forgot that cell phones don't work here. It was just a force of habit, and we laughed. You felt confident that our children would be safe with me, and you would see us again on Monday morning. A short trip, but we were going to make the most of it. By now, any blues I had were long gone, and for the remainder of the trip I played I Spy with Luke. Garrett was half asleep and Colt listened to tunes as we got further up the mountains, leaving the world behind without a care. At the final rest stop where I had a signal, I checked to be sure you hadn't messaged me. I was almost about to let you know we were near our destination but decided to not bother you. Then we drove another 45 minutes and made it to the cabin. There isn't another structure for miles. Your dad owned so much land up here with his logging business, and most of the forest is still untouched. We did see a few of the trucks about 5 miles down the South Pass, but nothing that would interrupt the untamed beauty of the mountaintop. Luke ran up toward the overlook on the east side of the cabin and hollered excitedly towards the valley below. It echoed for miles. The cabin itself is just like we left it. Frozen in time, I suppose. A massive den opens in the front with your dad's hunting trophies on the back wall. Garrett asked me if that old blunderbuss your dad kept actually fired. I told him I would hate to find out. A kitchen to the left along with downstairs bathroom and game room and an office. I told the boys to take their stuff upstairs as I pulled off some of the drapes from the furniture. No one has bothered any of this stuff since we were last here, so it was rather dusty, but the rustic feel of the cabin was very inviting. The large back patio with sliding glass doors looks toward the East Valley as well. It's right above the basement stairs where the laundry and freezer and generator are at, and it's also a perfect place to sit and drink an ice-cold beer. I have to admit, I wish I had brought some. Looking toward the miles of forest, I felt lonely and exhilarated all in the same moment. The woods were so quiet, almost haunting. I wondered if during the time we spent here we would even find anything worth hunting for. Luke was first on the patio, checking out the old binoculars that were still sitting on the deck and scanning the forest for any signs of life. The forest did seem unusually still, though. He asked me if we could go bird spotting later in the day, and I said we would. And then I told him to get his brothers and help me with the fishing gear. The plan was to go to the old pond and fetch our dinner, like real wilderness explorers. The boys met me at the Tahoe, and I frowned as I saw Colt still wasting time on his cell phone. Despite the fact that there wasn't good signal here, he was waving it around in the air, hoping for one last chance to shoot a text. I tossed the phone in the back of the Tahoe and ordered him to lug the lure box, leading all of them down a western path that zigzagged to the pond where your dad fished all the time. For the rest of the afternoon, we lazily sat on the pier in lawn chairs and cast our lines. Colt brought a radio, but instead of catching any tunes, it was just weather reports. A meteor shower was expected for the night. Luke asked if we could stay up to watch it. It was just a relaxing day. I remember thinking that this was the sort of escape I needed, but it wasn't meant to last. After catching a few trout, I told the boys to head inside and shower while I went to the basement to gut the fish. We were going to eat our small catch and then probably watch one of the VHS tapes that your dad collected. The evening wore down without a hitch, and I found myself just barely able to stay awake as all of us piled on the couch to watch a classic B-movie. Something about an invasion. Somewhere in the middle of the black and white film, I drifted off, and the boys were just as dead tired too. I wish I could say I had good dreams that night, but the smell of burnt popcorn is the last decent memory I have. Somewhere along in the night, all of us were awakened by the loudest crash. Garrett jumped up first and I fumbled to find the lights. All of us were staring out the back door, where we saw a distinct trail of ash flowing up from the edge of the valley. A few moments later, the power in the cabin went out and I guessed whatever had happened out in the woods was affecting the generator. The boys wanted to go investigate. I told them to stay put until I found a working flashlight, but every device I tried in the cabin was suddenly drained of power. That didn't sit right with me, and it made my curiosity intensify as I told the boys to stay close and follow me toward the impact site. The air seemed unusually still that night. Not even the crickets were stirring. And it occurred to me that we had not seen a single sign of animal life since arriving at the cabin. Did they somehow know about this beforehand? I knew that instinct could easily have driven them away, and I was getting a feeling in my stomach that maybe we should leave too. A few miles down an old trail, we found the crater. Luke excitedly hollered at the strange smoke in the area while I focused on the deep hole made in the earth. Whatever had crashed had gone down quickly, but it was too far down to make heads or tails of what it might be. I urged the boys to stay away from the edge as I tried to see if there was a different way to get down there and have a better look. Maybe it was a sixth sense that overtook me, but after several minutes of standing there staring at the hole, I got a hold of myself and told the boys we should all head inside. I promised we would come back in the morning and try to get a sample of whatever had crashed, but honestly, I just wanted to get out of there. Whatever was in that hole, it did not feel friendly in the slightest. They objected a little, but it was too dark for them to argue, especially when I pointed out the noise would attract predators. Colt tried to say that there wasn't a bear for miles, but I gave him the stink eye and he shut his mouth. Back in the cabin, I told them all to get to bed. Once I was sure they were in their rooms, I went out to the patio and looked toward the crater again. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up as I heard this faint noise. I couldn't be sure where it was coming from. It almost felt like it was engulfing me. I rubbed my tired eyes and collapsed on the couch. I had no reason to think anything else would happen that night. But boys will be boys. As I slept, they concocted a plan to go down into the crater. I'm not sure whose idea it was, or if it mattered, but they somehow managed to sneak past me and gathered rope and climbing equipment from the basement on the way. I only found out because when I woke to go to the restroom, I nearly jumped from the couch. Luke was standing there keeping an eye on me as a lookout. As soon as he saw how angry I was, he panicked and claimed it was all Garrett's idea, but I didn't care. I just needed to know where they were. Luke nervously pointed to the crater, and I rushed into the night to find his brothers. He was right at my heels as I shouted to his older brothers, thanking the stars they hadn't descended into the pit when I found them. Colt had found a rope, though, and was testing it out against the trunk of a tree when I caught them red-handed. Of course, I scolded them, but I was also thankful I hadn't arrived a moment too late. Or so I thought. Luke was catching his breath near the precipice when the ground gave way under his feet. It happened in slow motion. I tried to grab him, but he fell so quickly, all I could was watch and listen to his scream. The world felt like it was spinning as I shouted to him, trying to make sure he was okay. My heart racing even faster when he did not respond. I told Colt to pass me the rope. He hurriedly obeyed me, and I wrapped it tight around my waist. Then I used the heavy tree as my hoist to head into the dark pit. I kept calling to Luke, but couldn't see anything. The pit felt like it was a mile long, and every second that I couldn't find him felt like a lifetime. Finally, I hit the bottom and I tried to feel around for our son. The ground was cool, hard, and filled with indentations. Something from above had definitely crashed here, and it made me nervous to realize I was standing on top of this otherworldly object. I also felt a crack in the middle, like an eggshell splintering. Something sticky was oozing out, and I imagined the most repulsive yolk. Finally, I touched Luke's hand and pulled him to my chest. I also felt blood, and that made me panic. I needed to get up and get him to the hospital. I held him against my body and pulled away from the rock as fast as I could. I still felt his heart beating slowly, even though he was unconscious, and that gave me hope. I just needed him to hang on a little longer. Back at the mouth of the pit, I placed Luke on the ground and got a better look at his injuries. Blood and strange black powders smeared the right side of his face. I'm not going to lie to you, Christy, it looked bad. I tossed the rope off and ordered the boys to hurry for the Tahoe. My mind was racing as I ran with our youngest in my arms. Sure, my body was burning and pulsating with pain, but I didn't care. His life was on the line. My worst fears came true when we made it to the Tahoe, and I realized the power in the car battery had also been drained. We were miles from anywhere, and it was the dead of night. I told Colt to open the doors to the cabin, and I took Luke inside, placing him on one of the couches in the den. I then ordered Garrett get to ice from the freezer and bandages from the downstairs bathroom as Colt closed the door. He was trying his best to not cry. I was too, if I'm being honest. And as I stared at Luke's face, I realized that black powdery substance seemed to be spreading. It was covering almost all of his head now, and I shouted for them to hurry as I took his shirt off and checked for any other injuries. Garrett and Colt stood aside as I kept trying to wake their brother, shouting his name. I didn't know what else to do. I prayed to God that our boy not be taken from us. Luke suddenly took out a wide gasp and began to gag, his eyes bulging as he grabbed at his throat. That black material was now seeping into his airways. "Fight it! Come on! Get him in the shower and get this stuff off him!" I shouted hysterically as I tried to help him up. But it was already too late. A few moments later, Luke wasn't breathing at all, his body jerking violently to whatever that black stuff was doing to him. Then he was very, very still. I collapsed in a heap of tears as I grabbed at him and tried to make him come back to me. Garrett and Colt said nothing. I honestly don't know what they felt. But their brother was gone. I checked for vital signs a few more times, but it was pointless. I draped my coat over his body and stood up, trying not to lose my cool again in front of my other two sons. They blabbered and cried and apologized, and I honestly couldn't even begin to describe how awful I felt as I held them. I promised we would go home as soon as the power came back on. As we held each other there near the back door, Colt wordlessly pushed away and pointed toward Luke. I turned in surprise to see that our boy was sitting up, his entire body now an ashy brown color. His eyes were dark red, and that powder he had been covered in was now slowly falling off his body like a mist. The thing that infected our son screamed and began to crawl toward us. Garrett and Colt fumbled over the furniture to race to the kitchen. I ordered them upstairs and blocked the steps. The strange undead abomination that now wore Luke's face didn't seem to be able to visibly find us, shambling about the den like a mad animal. Was it searching for food? Did it intend to harm us? I found the answer out quickly as it shrieked and coughed up more powder, some of which burned my skin. I managed to wash it off in the kitchen sink quickly, realizing this alien menace was intent on killing and subduing all of us. Before I had time to even think about a plan, the thing was cornering me in the kitchen. I grabbed a knife to protect myself, its tongue spewing out of Luke's mouth and sliding across the floor. It was such an ungodly sight. I knew our son was gone, and I had to fight to save Garrett and Colt. I rammed the knife in the creature's chest and then ripped it out to slash at the throat. I had no idea if it was simply using our son's body as a host, or if it had another way of survival. But I simply had to end it. The alien was stronger than I anticipated, grabbing me and pulling me toward the wall. Its skin bulged as it prepared to spew more powder in my eyes. But instead, a shriek exited its lungs as I heard the sharp thud of an arrow strike it. It lost its footing, and I looked up to see Garrett was holding his crossbow, preparing to fire again as the beast tossed me aside and crawled up the side of the wall to the second floor. Garrett was not prepared for its ferocity and speed. I screamed and tried to draw the beast's attention to me as I struggled to stand, but it was already too late again. It burst out more of the black smoke, grabbing a hold of Garrett and dragging him toward the edge of the second-floor railing. I motioned for Colt to run down the stairs as his older brother fought for his life, tumbling down to the den floor and crashing into the coffee table. The beast was trying desperately to consume him, stretching Luke's skin like a net over his body. I yanked Colt toward me and ran for the basement, desperate for a new plan, as Garrett begged me to help. I reached for the crossbow he had dropped and fired another shot. Somehow, this one bounced off the creature. It had hardened Luke's skin to become like a shell, and I was helpless again as my second son was eaten alive, screaming for mercy. I plunged into the basement, slamming the door closed and demanding we barricade it with anything and everything we could find. Colt rushed and found several old boxes of junk and a few other items, but I knew it wouldn't be enough to do the trick. We had to find a way to escape the cabin, find help. Otherwise, we will all die here, I realized. I couldn't even properly mourn Garrett when the creature began to bang on the basement door, trying to find us. Colt was trembling, clawing for an exit somewhere else. We used adrenaline to push the washer aside and found an old crawl space near to the dryer. It looked like it was used to push lint out, but made wide to avoid clogs, just barely big enough for Colt to get out. I demanded he flee as I heard the door splinter and snap. Down the mountain. The rest stop was a few miles, but if he kept running, he would find it. He crawled away as I found bags of ice to defend myself with. The creature was nearly in the basement. It now took the form of our two boys combined, their arms and legs dangling like spider limbs as it raced toward me. Their heads merged into a dreadful mouth as it tried to attack. I flinched and ran up the stairs, this time slamming the door from the other side. I tried to think of anything I could use to kill the thing. The only idea that came to my mind was fire. Despite the loss of power, I knew the old propane stove worked, and the fireplace could be stoked. I would have to destroy this cabin and try to make the beast burn up in the process. But time was running out. I hurried to turn on the valves and then scrambled in the kitchen to find some of your dad's old cigarettes. Ironic what killed him might be the one thing that saved me, I thought. Then I heard a noise from below like bones breaking, and my heart sunk. From the basement stairwell, an abomination lurched out. It could hardly move at all now, combined with all the flesh of our 3 boys. Colt had returned to save me, I guessed, only to go straight into the creature's maw. It used their voices to taunt me, shrilling and shaking as it struggled to move toward me. I realized their combined size was too much for the beast to handle and seized the opportunity. I ran for your dad's trophy wall and loaded his ancient blunderbuss. The thing hadn't been fired in ages, but I only needed it to work just the one time. The alien was almost on top of me, and I pointed toward its unfathomable mouth and fired. I can't even describe the explosion of guts that cascaded across the cabin, but the deed was done. I sit here now, having burned the corpses and made sure not a single part of the beast remains, struggling to stay alive and pen this confession. This testimony to our survival and the survival of all humankind requires you to believe me. I am sure the creature infected me as well, and it won't be long it will take over my mind. It's evolved since it first struck. When it took Luke, it was mindless. Now it sees that to survive, it will need to be smart. Be silent and hide in plain sight. And I think it has found a way to recreate hollow shells of our boys. I keep having strange visions of them laying in their upstairs beds, covered in silk like that of a spider. Except it ebbs and flows. It breathes. The creature will hide what happened here masterfully. When you come here to meet me and our weekend trip is over, you will be unaware of what transpired. Garrett, Colt, Luke, and I will smile and be ready to return home. But you must not believe the smiles. I have managed to use what little sense is left within me and hide this letter in a place that I know it can't find, but you will always check. I grow weak. My mind is not my own. Forgive me, Christy. Please make certain we do not die here in vain. Please stop it from spreading. If I hadn't drunk an entire gallon of tea back at the hotel, maybe none of this would have happened. Well, maybe if we hadn't gotten kicked out of the hotel, none of this would have happened. It had been just the 2 of us in the small car, but with the animosity heavy on the air, it felt overcrowded. I don't know what had been worse, the hour of arguing, the 2 hours of silence afterwards, or the burgeoning realization that maybe I didn't know him as well as I thought I did. I studied him out of the corner of my eye. We'd been together for several months, but the recent experience left me wondering if I had ever even met the real Brian, who he truly was on the inside. It had been our very first trip together. We'd saved up for one of those super fancy hotels and had been having a great time until, of course, Brian decided to attempt a 5-finger discount in the jewelry store in the lobby. He told me when we first started dating that he'd had some run-ins with the law in the past, when he was young, and that was the only way to put food on the table, and I'd understood. But this wasn't the same. It wasn't for survival, it was just greed. We'd both spent the rest of our vacation money and then some, paying for that $800 watch so no charges would be pressed. They still kicked us out. I don't blame them. Asking him to stop at the next place we came across was the first thing I'd said to him in hours, and he nodded solemnly. My discomfort was escalating to the point where I was considering asking him to pull over on the side of the road, rain be damned, when we saw the dim sign flickering in the distance. The small store was out of place on the quiet, tree-lined mountain road. We'd been deep in a tunnel of trees, and hadn't seen so much of a hint of the lights in the distance. It seemed to just appear into view as we went around the bend. I didn't recall seeing it on the way to the hotel, so it was a pleasant surprise. I felt a flood of relief wash over me. It stuck out in the otherwise beautiful mountain landscape, windows so dirty that the light inside barely reached us through them. Several letters on the sign lit up in such a way that the only word we could even see was a blood-red Mart flickering. Any relief I'd managed to feel was short-lived. When we walked in, we both froze as we took in the interior. I instantly wished we'd just stopped by the side of the road after all. I looked at Brian and could tell he felt it too. He was fiddling with his new watch and took off his glasses, cleaned them on his shirt, and put them back on, as if that would make what he was seeing make more sense. There were no other customers, no employees visible. It was just the two of us. Ceiling tiles hung askew, and the floor was filthy. We had to step over a drain in the floor with grimy stains circling it to walk in. If it weren't for the lights, gentle hum of the AC, and grinding sounds floating from down the long hallway at the back, I'd have thought the place was abandoned. It was humid inside, and the smell coming from the old coolers that lined the back walls hit me as soon as we walked in. It reminded me of the summer my dad had decided to dabble in taxidermy in our basement. The slight hint of rot that lingered on the damp air indicated poorly done taxidermy at that. As I darted towards the back towards the restroom sign, a placard dangling off it caught my eye. Informed me the restroom was for paying customers only. I quickly perused the shelves for something to buy. The aisles were tall, nearly to the ceiling, and despite the store being somewhat small, I felt the panicked sense of being cornered and trapped in an endless maze, at risk of becoming lost in there forever. The food on the shelves resembled nothing like the usual chips and candy these types of stores carried. There were rows upon rows of soft-looking mystery items in plastic wrap. Some of them leaked a red-brown residue down the shelves. None of it looked remotely appealing. I passed by a section with a stained placard that said, "Handcrafted from local artists," that was filled with eclectic items, none of which seemed to go together. There were torn shirts with random logos, nothing related to the town or area we were in, stained with mud, grass, and God knows what else. Dried, ropey things formed small and delicate sculptures of animals, unlike any I'd seen before. I reached for a bracelet with intricately carved white beads, but nearly dropped it when I realized the band was made up of woven human hair. It left a residue on my hand, and I noticed then that the same sour rot smell was coming from the collection of items, too. I opted for a flat and lukewarm Dr. Pepper instead, and placed two $2 coins on the glass counter in front of the hand-scrawled "Shoplifters will be processed" sign near the register. I figured I misread it. After all, it looked like it had been written by a hand unused to holding a pen. Brian had grabbed an armful of those unnerving plastic-wrapped packages but hovered at the counter a bit too long. I could hear the scrape of him retrieving the coins on the glass, the sound of him dropping them into his pocket. He gave me a pointed stare as he did so. I sighed, so tired of arguing that I just walked away from him and down the hallway. I figured I'd pay, again, after he got back in the car. No sooner had I closed the door to the women's room behind me than I could hear him talking to someone. His voice rose until he was nearly yelling. Mortified and trying to delay being involved in another incident that day, I splashed water on my face while trying to drown out what appeared to be a one-sided argument. I kept trying to wash the grimy feeling that had lingered on my hands after picking up the bracelet, but no matter how I scrubbed, I couldn't get it off. It kept getting worse. I felt nauseous when I realized the greasy residue was coming from the pale yellow bar of soap. I decided I'd scrub my hands raw at our next stop and stepped out into the hall and back to the store. Brian wasn't there. I called out for him, but all I heard in answer was that same vague whirring and drilling sound coming from further down the long hallway. I doubled back to the car, but found it empty. I circled the store, my frustration turning to panic as I shouted his name and still got no response. I called his phone, it just rang, and rang before going to voicemail. The car was locked and he had the keys. I couldn't help but feel nervous, standing out there in the rain. We were still in the middle of the deep woods, and with clouds obscuring the light of the moon and stars, the area was blanketed in darkness. I reluctantly headed back inside. Somehow, the smell had managed to become even worse. I gagged when the wet, disgusting air hit my nose again. It was so strong I could nearly taste it, putrid on my tongue. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was always someone just behind me as I walked quickly through the tall aisles, but whenever I looked over my shoulder, there was never anything there. I called his phone, wondering how I'd managed to lose him in such a small store when I finally heard it ringing. It was echoing from down that long hallway. As I headed towards it, I heard someone moving on the other side of the floor-to-ceiling aisle, placing something onto the shelf with a sickening, wet thud, before weaving lithely through the aisles behind me. "Brian?" I called out softly, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, trying to disguise my fear. I knew it wasn't him. I don't know how, but I knew it. Have you ever had the feeling that if you look closely enough at something, if you truly see it, you'll never be able to close your eyes again without it haunting you? That feeling of being in close proximity to something that your fragile mind was never meant to know existed. I forced myself to turn around anyways. Once again, whoever or whatever had been there was gone by the time I rounded the aisle, but I heard a gentle clinking sound and saw a trail of red-pink droplets. I followed it back to that section. Handcrafted from local artists, there was something new hanging from a hook near the shelves. Wet, glistening strips dangled from along what looked to be a curved bone with bits of gristle still attached. From one of them hung an expensive men's wristwatch. Another was tied around a shattered thick glasses lens. Yet another sagged under the weight of car keys. They gently swayed with the motion of having been recently placed. Fluid continued to drip from the still wet viscera and mingled with the mud on my shoes. Shoplifters will be processed. I didn't need to see the items down the other aisles to figure out what I was looking at. What must have happened? I could already tell that we'd never have another argument, ever again. I heard a door open and close in the back, soft footsteps approaching from down that hallway. I realized that in my distraction, I'd forgotten to put money back on the counter. I choked up, but knew there was nothing I could do for him. So, I tossed the first bills I found in my purse onto the floor, frantically untangled the car keys, and in shock, I drove myself the remaining 4-hour drive home. Every so often, along the quiet country roads, those I could have sworn were empty on the drive up, I'd see that grimy building, the sign marked